finalize new testing instruments that are scheduled to come on board in June and July that will increase testing capacity regionally. Yesterday, Governor Cooper announced that the state will start providing a list of coronavirus testing sites to help people find a free testing location. We are also pleased to report that all IFC residents have officially been relocated to a safer environment. We appreciate the council's approval of the use of CDBG funds to assist in paying for that move and the efforts of numerous staff and community partners who were involved in planning, coordinating, and executing this relocation. We are finding different ways to encourage and support our community during the pandemic. Last week, the Chapel Hill Fire Department and Police Department staff joined with first responders from across the county to show their appreciation for healthcare workers with a drive-by parade on the UNC Medical Center campus. You can see in the corner there, I think we're having some issues with bringing the full slide deck up for you, but you can see the emergency personnel who are on hand to recognize the folks at UNC Medical. And the town's community arts and culture team is developing a public art campaign called Positively Chapel Hill that will include art-wrapped buses, downtown window installations, and more that will focus on community diversity and resilience as we continue to respond to this crisis. Another issue we've been working on over the last week is mask distribution. This initiative will utilize existing distribution networks and community partners to identify and meet needs within our community. Staff is working to implement the first phase of this plan next week that will focus on the targeted distribution of masks along with information about safe usage to our most vulnerable populations. For phase 2, we will work with residents and organizations that are making cloth masks to get them distributed to the community. And finally, last Friday, we moved into phase 1 of Governor Cooper's 3-phased reopening plan. Kelly Drayton, our emergency management coordinator, is on hand to provide us with an update on the first few days of phase 1. Kelly.
All right, good evening, Mayor and Council. So now that we're a few days into phase 1, we wanted to provide an update on how our community is navigating this transition. Our Joint Information Center is in the middle of a messaging campaign that outlines phase 1. This campaign includes a press release sent directly to community members, social media messages, outreach to immigrant and refugee communities, and amplification of key county and state messaging. Our call center reached an impressive milestone this week, receiving its 500th call since the COVID-19 event. And we have seen a slight increase in our call load since Friday. Today's call count was actually the 3rd highest since the call center was activated. Top categories for questions continue to center around the status of our parks as well as yard waste collection. Our law enforcement staff continues with an education first approach to enforcement. Since entering phase 1, police have had a slight uptick in reported stay-at-home or social distancing violations, totaling 6 such reports as of this morning. Several of these incidents were related to the fact that this past weekend would have been the traditional graduation weekend, so there were several related gatherings where physical distancing was not observed. In each case, our officers were successful in sharing information about phase 1 and the stay-at-home order, and they were able to resolve the violations without taking any enforcement action. We continue to coordinate with the Health Department and the Chamber of Commerce to help local business navigate the latest guidance from the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the Centers for Disease Control. And although under phase 1, our town facilities remain closed, staff's working on creative ways to provide services to the public. This week, the library began a trial run of contact-free curbside pickup of items that had been on hold since the facility closed on March 13th. And as you can see from the picture on this slide, the community is responding very positively to this experiment. And finally, as we begin to reopen, staff's collaborating with partners from across the county to look at how we can enhance economic activity through innovative practices, easing regulations, and activating open spaces. So we continue to look forwards in our planning efforts. We're taking steps now to identify changes to our facilities in anticipation of future reopening phases. This could include additional partitions at reception areas, limited public access, and continuing to telecommute for much of our workforce. Our recovery team continues to meet with Orange County and other municipalities to formalize our long-term recovery principles, structure, and planning process. Representatives from this recovery team have begun talking with potential third-party contractors to begin to define scope, roles, and expectation for program management. This team will employ a community-based approach to recovery, which will engage local stakeholders such as the Chamber of Commerce, our downtown partnership, and other community organizations throughout the recovery process. And as always, we'll continue to keep safety, sustainability, and equity at the forefront of our recovery efforts. And with that, we would be happy to take your questions.
Any specific questions? I have some more information to share, but anybody? All right, you can always email, like I said, and get some information that can be shared out with everybody. Okay, a food update. We have the most amazing coordination going on with all of our community partners in the food category. Last week, they distributed 220 15-pound produce boxes, plus 1,360 times 3-day weekend meal boxes. And they plan to continue leveraging the USDA funds to provide food for the weekends for families. We've received some grants for more produce boxes. And so now we're providing some students with meals for every day of the week as well. With the help of Porch, the town, and the food bank, distributed food to 543 families last Wednesday. And our friends at the library provided books with the food. So we're doing both minds and body nourishment this week. So that's really good. Table, the IFC, Meals on Wheels, all kinds of partner groups are working so hard. And we know that we need to continue to support them because this need is only going to continue during the next a few months. I'm not even sure how long. You heard about some mask distribution, and I want to say thank you to council members Gu, Anderson, Boynton, and Ryan. They're working with staff, helping coordinate, figuring out a plan to get masks distributed to people who want them, need them, and they don't have as much access to them. And we have a lot of volunteers in our community who are making masks so that we can do this. And it's a wonderful partnership, and our housing and community group is coordinating all that. And so we're very, very pleased. Utility and rental assistance is going to be continuing to be a strong need in our community, and the town and the county and IFC have programs in place to help with this. OWASA has the Care to Share program that I encourage everyone to help. If you could do $10 a month, even for a short term, that helps pay these water bills. OWASA's starting to see some rise in their delinquent water bills, and it's a community water system, so we need to help. And like I said, this is going to go on for a while. So this is going to be a continued need as we move forward. Some people will be able to recover faster than others. And we want to make sure that everyone in our community has an opportunity to recover from this. And we want to help and support the groups that are doing the great work and our staff that's working so hard to make all of that a reality. All right. I'm going to share one more update I forgot to do earlier. Michael Parker and I were on the MPO call today, long call, and we learned a lot about what's going with NCDOT and about why they had to stop the projects and where the funding has gone. It was startling to find out that this past year's storm bill was over $330 million, and they still have 75 roads that are closed in North Carolina that they just can't get to. They have not been reimbursed from the storm before from the federal government to the tune of about $330 million. And the projects that were underway hopefully get to continue underway. Those that haven't started yet, like our West End restriping project, are going to be delayed. In 2009, when we had the recession, DOT said it took them 57 months to recover from that recession. And that was knowing that they were going to continue to get gas tax money coming in because commuters were going to still be commuting. This year, it's a little different because the gas tax receipts are down over 40% as people aren't commuting. And so that's really played a huge blow to their budget. There's lots of different strategies and trying to work together. Shovel-ready projects may have a window of opportunity in August, is what we learned, like we did last year, when federal funds hadn't been pulled down across the nation and you were allowed to spend those monies if you had a shovel-ready project. So we're keeping our eye on that, but when people ask why we aren't doing some of these projects, why DOT is not filling potholes, there's all kinds of things there. Really can't do the work because the funding's not there and they don't know when it's going to be replenished. So we'll get you more information and details. We learn more about this, but it was a very long presentation with lots of information. And this is an unusual time, folks. So anyway, I will turn it back to you, Manager Jones.
Mayor, our first item on the agenda is the north-south bus rapid transit update for you. We are looking for your feedback on this as we move forward. It's an important project, but as you pointed out, there's a lot of interest in transportation dollars these days, and we're still competing for some transportation dollars to make this project happen. And Brian Litchfield and his team have been hard at work on this project for several years now. We are getting to a point where we need to make some important decisions soon. Tonight, we're seeking some of your guidance as we're taking the next steps in this project. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brian and his team. Brian, we can't hear you if you're talking.
Okay, how about now?
We're hearing you with an echo.
All right, we got rid of that.
You're good.
So sorry about that.
Okay.
Thank you, manager, and good evening, mayor and council. Sorry, it's good to be with you virtually, at least from the transit conference room. And doing so, that's part of the reason for the distance here. As you heard a little bit ago, we're having some challenges with our technology here. So hopefully you'll be able to hear me okay as we move through this. So our agenda for this evening, we're going to provide a little bit of a background on the North-South BRT project, or NSBRT project. As many of you are aware of this project and been involved with it for some time, others may not be as aware. Most importantly, we'll provide an update on the traffic engineering. As you may recall, in October, we presented some information on the traffic analysis, and council had asked for some additional clarification and some additional questions. And we have some responses to those. And we spent the last several months working very closely with NCDOT, who, as you all know, owns this infrastructure. And anything that we do within this corridor requires their concurrence. So we've been working closely with them to get concurrence on our next steps. We'll talk a little bit about the crosswalks and the multi-use path that will be implemented as part of this project. And then we'll also share with you, as the manager mentioned, while tonight we're talking just sharing information to get some feedback, we do plan to return to a June council meeting and ask for concurrence on a draft recommendation. And we're going to share that recommendation with you this evening. So just as a reminder for this project, this is one that we've been working on for some time. It originated in 2011 when the alternatives analysis was initially approved. In 2012, the Chapel Hill 2020 plan was adopted and included the NSBRT project in that. The original locally preferred alternative was approved by council in April of 2016. And then we were approved to enter into project development, which is the first step in the federal funding process, in November of 2016. In January of 2019, council adopted an updated LPA. The Federal Transit Administration, or FTA, reviewed that in February of 2019, and they asked us at that point in time to identify a final LPA. And what they meant by that is that we need the LPA that was originally adopted said there was a convert or construct option in several sections of the corridor, and they need us to confirm whether we're going to convert or construct or a combination of both. But we need to tell them what that is before we can continue to move forward in the federal process. So in October of 2019, we provided an update to council, as I mentioned earlier. You all had some questions, and we're prepared to address those this evening. And then in February of 2020, FTA released their new starts, small starts ratings, and our project, along with the project in Raleigh, were rated, and we received medium rating, which allows us to continue in the FTA funding process. So just a reminder of the context and vision is why we're undertaking this project and why we've been working on it for 9 years now. Is the project allows the town and our funding partners, the university and the town of Carrboro, to meet mobility demand as our region continues to grow. Our current system is close to capacity. Most of the buses that are operating in that corridor, while not today in normal circumstances, are at or beyond full. The proposed system, the BRT, is a long-term scalable solution. It's something, again, that we can expand on both in hours and frequency, and also where that system could potentially serve. Importantly, it serves as a support for current and planned development. And this is also a multimodal project. So again, we're talking a lot about buses and bus rapid transit, but I think it's very important to remember that a significant part of this project is investing in things like the multi-use path. So the picture that you see kind of on your right-hand side, that's not exactly what our path will look like, but remember, when this project is done, 84% of this corridor from Eubanks to Southern Village will have a multi-use path on both sides of the corridor that will allow pedestrians and cyclists to safely move through that corridor. And it will also connect with regional transit options. So not only local transit services, but also regional transit services provided by Go Triangle, and then services provided by Park coming out of the Piedmont area. So for regional context, again, as you see on, I think your left-hand side there, you see our BRT project that shows the NS BRT corridor that's currently underway. Our short-range transit plan has also envisioned an east-west corridor that you see in the light blue there that would run from kind of the Easttown 40 corridor over through downtown campus area and out to through Carrboro, perhaps as far as Whitecross. So again, the NSBRT, while an important project, again, it was identified as the first of perhaps several projects within the Chapel Hill Carrboro service area. Additionally, within the region, some of you may be aware on the upper right-hand side, the regional RTA is looking at feasibility of bus rapid transit projects throughout the region. So they're looking at ways to connect bus rapid transit from Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Cary, and many other places. So that's a project that's currently underway. And I would note on the right-hand side, bottom right-hand side, Raleigh has got a plan in place where they plan to implement 4 bus rapid transit corridors and a high-frequency bus rapid transit system by 2027. So just a note on that, Raleigh, their first corridor, they entered into project development a year ago. Again, we've been in project development for almost 4 years now. They entered a year ago. They just announced earlier this week that they've completed 30% design. They also received their project rating the same time that we did. And they also plan to submit a second corridor for rating later this year when those projects open up as well too. So I note that again, as hesitate to say that we're in a competition with Raleigh, but as I think the mayor mentioned and the manager mentioned, we are competing for the same funds at the federal level. And as those funds are relatively scarce, whoever is kind of first to the plate generally fares better than those that come in second or third. So it's important to understand what our regional partners are doing in that regard. Additionally, there may be demand for other regional BRT projects as the region looks for replacements for the former light rail project as well too. So again, just where we're at in the process, you've all seen this slide before, but again, as a reminder, we're still in that second blue box that's there. We're still in the project development phase. So we've not finished our 30% design. We need the LPA in order to finish the 30% design. Station placement and conceptual design. We started some of that work a year and a half or so ago. Again, until we have the LPA, we've kind of paused that work because we don't want to spend a whole lot of time working on those things until we have a defined LPA and we know that FTA accepts that LPA. So We don't think it makes sense to spend a lot of resources doing things and working on that until we have concurrence from FTA on our final LPA. So before that, once that happens, then we potentially could move into engineering, which once we moved into that, we potentially would be at a place where we could compete for some funding that would be available, as the mayor mentioned earlier, for shovel-ready type projects. So we're about a step away from where that's at. Under the current scenario, and this all could change, both because of funding at the federal and state level, but our earliest construction would begin 2023 with potential implementation in 2027. Again, that's assuming a traditional funding approach. If we become eligible for and additional stimulus money becomes available, that could potentially be expedited. But as of now, we're looking at 2027 before we implement our first BRT line. So the locally preferred alternative, again, just want to share some context in this regard. It's a general description of the type of transit service that will be used within the corridor. So in this case, bus rapid transit, that's been decided, and there's been consensus on that for some time. The running ways are identified. We've had previous conversations over the years about, should we be center running or curb running or median running? We've identified and selected the curb running for the corridor. What's left to be determined is, are we going to construct lanes or are we going to convert lanes? It also includes the alignment and then the beginning and the end of the route. As an important reminder, the LPA is general. So specific, such as specific locations for stations and engineering and those sort of things happen as we move into engineering and future planning phases. So while we've got a general sense of where the stations will be at, they are nowhere near locked in at this point in time. The LPA is important because it's a critical step in the funding process. It tells the Federal Transit Administration what alternative that we're going to be pursuing as we pursue local, regional, and federal funding. And importantly, it can be adjusted through the environmental or NEPA phase and also through the design phases. So for example, if we decided that as we have, that downtown would be a dedicated convert option. As we go through engineering or the environmental engineering, and we decide as a community and as a council, well, the convert option just isn't going to work through downtown. As long as we haven't made a submission for federal funding, we can adjust that, and we can do that in other areas of the corridor as well too. So again, I think we'll be talking through some of those options with you. I'd also note on your kind of right-hand side, again, we'll talk convert versus construct. And I want to make sure folks understand that even when we're talking construct option within the entire length of this corridor, we're talking construction within the existing curb, right? So you see an example on the right-hand side there at Martin Luther King and Weaver Dairy. So even with, and that's showing a construct option. So even with a construct option, we're not going to make that intersection any wider than it is today. And in fact, as you'll see in later slides, and even under a construct option, the crosswalk links and others will actually be shorter under the BRT proposal than what they are today. So again, I think that's important as you hear the construct versus convert, and think about that. Construction for the BRT lanes does not mean that we're going outside of the existing curb. So we'll be staying with that. So with that, our next steps for the LPA, the Transit Partners Committee has approved the updated LPA that we'll be hearing about tonight. We'll have the presentation this evening, and then we plan to return either to the June 10th session or the June 24th session of council to seek final approval of the LPA. So with that, I will turn it over to Kevin Bauman with Kimley Horn, who is our traffic engineer. He'll provide an update on the traffic engineering, and then following him, Julius Superock with AECOM will talk with you about the pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, and then I'll return with a quick update on the final LPA. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Thanks, Brian. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so we're going to start our traffic discussion with a quick recap of the information we've shared previously, and talk through the areas of the corridor where we have been evaluating alternatives and really just share what we found in terms of traffic impacts. And then lastly, we'll share some data we've collected related to the types of trips on this road and try to answer this question of whether folks on this road are primarily local or through trips. So we've shared some of our analyses with this group previously. We looked at several different options for convert and construct on the corridor using both existing and future traffic. And based on those analyses, we're recommending to construct on the northern end of the corridor from Eubanks to really that Umstead Drive area, as well as the southern end of the corridor from NC 54 down to Southern Village. And this is, I mean, this recommendation is primarily driven by just the fact that the traffic volumes on those stretches of the corridor are really just too high to reduce the road down to a single vehicular lane in each direction. Now, for the area you see in green near the hospital area, we're recommending that the bus operate in mixed traffic just like it does today, primarily because a lot of that section is just one lane in each direction and is fairly constrained. So we wanted to really avoid excessive widening for a bus lane in those areas if we could. We looked at several different options for the area through downtown because the traffic volumes are much lower in that section. And because we're trying to reduce the footprint of the project, we're certainly wherever we can. And so based on some of the conversations we had with this group in late 2019, there was a request for us to go back and run another scenario on what we've found with some lower assumed traffic volumes instead of growing traffic into the future. And there was also a request to evaluate some creative signal timing solutions, particularly for that downtown area where we are most heavily considering the convert option. And the idea was to look at whether some changes to signal timing could make the convert a more viable solution. So one quick note relative to that picture I just showed you before, there's one portion of the corridor in that northern area where we're actually proposing to convert an existing lane. And that's because it currently has 3 northbound travel lanes and has enough capacity to handle that traffic with just 2 northbound travel lanes for vehicles plus a bus lane. So that's the one sort of exception to the rule north of that Umstead Drive area where we are actually proposing to convert there. And really that's just an effort to reduce the cross section of the road and also maintain uniformity in the cross section along that stretch. I mentioned before that we incorporated a 5% reduction in vehicular volumes into the analysis based on a review of data from other BRT projects in the region. So you'll see that reflected in the analysis we showed today. And lastly, we've had a lot of really regular coordination with NCDOT since we spoke with this group late last year. Their staff has been able to review all of our analysis and really in general has concurred with the conclusions that we're going to be sharing today relative to these alternatives. So for that kind of gray box in the middle, we looked at 3 different options for the cross section in downtown where the traffic volumes are lower and where it's really not feasible to increase the footprint of the road from an impacts standpoint. We looked at 2 different convert options and one which would just have the bus operate in mixed traffic like it does today. So the first alternative was what we're calling full convert, which would from Umstead Drive to Manning Drive near the UNC Hospital would convert a lane to bus only along that entire stretch of the road. The second alternative we looked at was we're calling partial convert, which is essentially the same as full convert, except for a section of mixed traffic operation in the vicinity around Cameron Avenue downtown. And really that was our attempt to go through the corridor, keep as much of the convert as possible, and remove the exclusive lane at an intersection that we had identified as a choke point. And the third option, the alternative you see on the right, is mixed traffic, which is fairly self-explanatory, which would just basically have the bus run in shared lanes like it does today for that stretch between Umstead and Manning. So let's take a look at how the travel time numbers compare between these alternatives, starting with buses. So regardless of the downtown treatment chosen, there's certainly a notable improvement projected for the buses over the current condition. There's not a substantial difference in travel time between the convert, partial convert, and mixed traffic options downtown from a bus perspective. Now, when you look at travel times for the general purpose vehicles, in general, the travel times are comparable. You see a slight improvement in travel time for the mixed traffic scenario versus the two convert scenarios, which isn't a huge surprise. And that difference of essentially keeping the lanes like they are today saves about on average a minute of travel time for cars through downtown. So essentially those longer delays and queues that you would expect to see at those downtown intersections are what is adding about a minute of travel time on average. Now, one of the many metrics we looked at in terms of expected vehicular operations is level of service. And I'm sure many in this group are familiar, but the letter grades you see here in this table are just like school, where A is the best and F is the worst. So here's a look at how the level service results compare between the alternatives at Rosemary and Franklin Street, those two intersections downtown. The boxes you see highlighted in orange are usually the letter grades we like to avoid, but as you probably know, there are certainly some intersections on this road that already operate in that orange range today. So you can see that the two convert options are expected to create longer delays in general than just operating the bus in mixed traffic, but it's not a drastic enough difference in delay that we would be uncomfortable with recommending the convert as a viable option through this area. One thing we did want to highlight is that if the town were to convert through downtown, this is the area with the greatest potential for some longer vehicular queues, really because this area would be reduced to a single lane. There is an existing pedestrian crossing near that blue arrow on the screen near Fraternity Court, which in this scenario, if we were to convert, has the potential to have some increased interactions with cars. As those queues get longer in each direction, especially during peak hours, you're likely to see cars spill through that crossing. And I know that's something that happens from time to time already today, particularly in that southbound direction from folks that are, sitting, waiting to make a right turn onto Cameron Avenue. So one potential improvement to help mitigate an issue like this is really just some supplementary signage like we're showing on the screen to draw greater attention to that crossing by drivers. So back to the level service information, this time down at Columbia and Cameron. You can see there's a more noticeable delay difference between the full convert and the other options. Taking the full convert would take that intersection from a level service E today right to that kind of EF range, right on the edge of those two thresholds. Now that difference in operations is a little bit larger than what we saw up at the Franklin and Rosemary intersections, but I will say it's worth noting that a level service in that range is not completely out of line with what some of the other intersections on the corridor experience today, and we don't see the full convert as something that is so drastic that it is creating an excessive harm to vehicular users in favor of the bus through this area. So some of you probably know that this intersection is sort of a choke point in this area in terms of how the traffic signal operates. And you may also be seeing that in that level service table, that in the mixed traffic and partial convert options, the level service actually gets better than it is today. And that's because we're proposing to really modify how the signal phasing operates at this location. The way the signal runs today, I'm sure for folks that have driven through this area, the first phase that happens is southbound Columbia Street goes, followed by northbound Columbia, indicated by the green arrow on the picture, followed by the movements on Cameron Avenue, followed by an exclusive phase for pedestrians to cross in all directions. Now, we're proposing something that is going to make this intersection operate a little more efficiently. And part of that would be allowing the northbound and southbound movements to run together. These are the two movements that have the heaviest traffic volumes. So really running them together allows us to give a lot of extra green time to the movements. And you can see in the picture here that blue chunk of the pie gets a lot bigger when you're able to run these two movements together. So we would run those two movements together, followed by the left turns on Columbia Street, followed by the Cameron Avenue movements, and then followed by the pedestrian crossing, just like we have out there today. So just to kind of hit on the major takeaways downtown, we think either the convert options or mixed traffic could be viable choices from a traffic perspective, as long as some of those signal timing improvements we talk about, I just talked about, are incorporated into the design. Ultimately, the final chosen alternative is something that has been selected and really should be considered based on whether there's a strong preference to maintain that consistent cross section through downtown, and whether the town is comfortable with the or whether the town is comfortable with kind of the drop add nature of what the partial convert would bring to this project. Whether there's the other thing that really needs to be considered is whether there's a preference to make operations slightly worse for vehicles for the sake of that benefit of the consistent cross section and having that consistent lane through downtown. Because I'm sure many of y'all have driven through this area and experienced just the challenge of driving in that rightmost lane today, where the buses are stopping pretty consistently through that area. And I mean, it's really not a fully usable or utilized lane for vehicles, just because of how heavy and consistent the bus traffic is through that area. So the full convert would really be an attempt to clean that up, make it clear, and really delineate which lanes are intended to be used for buses and which lanes are intended to be used for vehicles. Here's a concept of what an outside running bus lane might actually look like downtown. This is right at the intersection of Columbia and Rosemary. So just to sort of get everybody oriented, in the top right corner of this photo where my cursor is, that would be north. And then down here in the bottom left would be south. So Franklin Street is just off the picture, kind of on the left side. Note that in situations where there isn't a right turn lane, folks making right turn movements will still make those movements from that outside lane. So they would make a lane change movement to get over into the bus lane at the intersection and make a right turn. Now, for locations where there is an exclusive right turn lane, so for example, the southbound direction at Rosemary, vehicles would cross over the bus lane somewhere upstream and then make a right turn movement at the intersection, just like they do today. Here's another example up at Hillsborough Street. This is kind of in that Midtown Market shopping center area. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some data that we collected on travel patterns in the area. And the avenue that we chose to use for this was Streetlight. Now, Streetlight uses location-based information from phones to give you information about travel patterns, and they buy it directly from the cell phone providers. Now, we identified some locations along the MLK corridor, and we asked Streetlight to tell us about the destinations of folks that drive through certain spots. So it can help you figure out how far people drive on the corridor, as well as some key destinations for folks in the area. So in terms of this question of how far are people driving, take a look at the graphs. You can see that the one on the left is a typical morning peak, and the one on the right is a typical afternoon peak. And if you look at all of the cars that enter into the corridor from the NC 54 15501 interchange, which is kind of the bottom part of that picture where the yellow star is, about 40% of them have dropped off the road, dropped off the corridor by the time you get to the hospital area. And by the time you get through downtown, more than 90% of those folks have dropped off in the morning peak. In the afternoon, there's a little more through traffic through downtown, but it's still a fairly small portion of the overall trips. But the kind of high level takeaway that we found from the data is, and you can see that less than 5% of the traffic is driving this corridor all the way from one end to the other. So let's take a quick look at the other direction. This is looking at trips that start up at the Eubanks Road I-40 area where that yellow star is in the picture. And you can see that very few of them are making it to downtown, and even fewer are driving all the way through the corridor. So fundamentally, and this is telling us that the data suggests that the majority of the trips on this corridor are local rather than folks driving all the way through. And it's important to keep that in mind relative to the traffic impacts that we're discussing. Here's a quick different look at a similar pattern. This picture, instead of looking at the percentage of traffic that remains on the road along a certain distance, this graphic is showing the percentage of traffic that ends up at a particular destination. So you can see that many of the folks entering the corridor from the south end are ending up at destinations on that south side of the corridor, rather than going all the way through. And the same is true for folks that are starting up towards the north end of the corridor. Okay, so with all that said, given some of the trade-offs we've laid out relative to these alternatives, the project team's recommendation is to carry forward the full convert through downtown as a part of the LPA. Brian and Matt and the technical committee and the other stakeholders involved in this project have looked at these options, and the recommendation from those groups is that giving that clear delineation of separate bus and vehicular lanes downtown is going to be the best option for this area in terms of what goes into the draft LPA. And Brian's going to summarize this as well as the rest of the draft LPA recommendation here in a second. But first, I want to turn it over to Julia to talk a little bit about some of the pedestrian and bicycle improvements that are being completed as a part of this project. Julia?
All right. Thank you, Kevin. So I will be talking about the crosswalks and multi-use path portion of the presentation. So as part of our design of bus rapid transit, we also want to be thinking about that active transportation component. And one of the concerns we heard was that crosswalks might be getting longer based on the dedicated guideways that we're going to be looking at for the BRT. So Jeff Kuntz and our engineering team did some measurements and consolidated everything into this table. So what we can see here on the top row is the crosswalks that are along the north-south BRT route. So these are the crosswalks that you drive through. And then we also on the second row looked at the side streets. So these are the crosswalks that are running kind of parallel to the corridor. So if we're looking at crosswalks that are on the route, we are suggesting to increase from 48, which is how many crosswalks there are now to 57. They currently average about 70 feet in length, and based on our current design plans, would increase to about 71 feet. So as you can see in the far right column there, 38 will see no change at all. 5 are increased, 5 are reduced, and there are 9 new designated crossings that will be at signalized intersections. So the vast majority of the crosswalks will see no change along the route itself. Then when we look at the side streets, there's 46 that are existing, 51 crosswalks that are proposed. And then as Brian was referencing earlier, we actually see that the average length shrinks from 58 feet to 57. Similarly, the majority see no change. 3 would be increased, 12 reduced, and there are 5 new designated crosswalks. So we feel that in terms of increasing opportunities for people to cross the street safely and really managing any growth in terms of distance that they need to travel, the designs really do help to support that active transportation. A couple of notes at the bottom there. So there's no changes to sidewalk lengths with either the convert or mixed traffic segment. It's only on the construct segments where there may be a little widening on either side. For the instances where there were increases or decreases, those were limited to less than 10 feet. The largest increase is down at the NC 54 interchange, and that's really a function of the bus pulling out of the lane to allow traffic to continue to flow past. So it's just that little segment, which that bump out means that the crosswalk's a little bit longer. The biggest reduction is at Weaver Dairy Road, and we can actually go to the next slide where I think we have a graphic of what that looks like. So on the left-hand side is the existing conditions, again, MLK at Weaver Dairy. On the right-hand side is what's proposed under the current design plans. So the difference, the reason that the crosswalk gets shorter is because the turning radius is decreased. So you'll see those yellow multi-use path markings decrease the distance that a pedestrian would have to cross while maintaining the traffic and allowing for that dedicated lane BRT. And then on the next slide, bicycle and pedestrian facilities. So along, again, as Brian mentioned earlier, along more than 80% of the corridor, there's going to be a bike path or multi-use path. In the areas in purple on this little diagram here, mostly through the downtown and through the UNC Hospitals campus, there will be sort of a Sharrow sidewalk situation. So that's maintaining existing conditions. So, you know, with the downtown alternatives, there's generally consistent walking experience among the alternatives. So that's not really a differentiator. Again, just the idea of maintaining existing conditions. And I will pass it back over to Brian.
Okay, thank you, Julia. So yeah, I think again, the important takeaway from the presentation on the crosswalks and multi-use path is, again, today, about 50% of that corridor has got some sort of bike lane in it. When this is, if this is implemented as currently proposed, about 85% of the corridor would have dedicated multi-use paths or bike lanes available, and the rest would be in bike lanes, or shared locations. So almost 100% of the corridor would have some sort of significant improvement to it. So just a quick summary of the LPA and what we've highlighted here on the screen for you. The yellow kind of highlights the things that are different or confirmed, or that we'd like to have confirmed from the original LPA. So things that aren't colored and aren't highlighted haven't changed since the original LPA was adopted. But what we're suggesting, based on the traffic information, based on the safety information, and concurrence from NCDOT, is that from Weaver Dairy Road to Westminster Drive, it would be convert a dedicated curb lane. Westminster Drive to Umstead or Hillsborough Street would be to construct a dedicated curb lane. Again, I think the reminder there is even when we're talking construct, we're talking within kind of that curb to curb segment. So we're not talking about widening significantly or adding 8 or 10 or 11 feet of lane each direction. We would do that within the existing envelope that's there. And then from Umstead and Hillsborough Street to North Street would be converted dedicated curb lane. The rest of the LPA would stay the same. So next slide, please. So with that, the next steps. So we would request adoption of the recommended LPA. As I mentioned earlier, the transit partners have approved the LPA that we just showed you. And we will return, we're working with the manager to determine which council meeting that will be, either the 10th or the 24th. Once that's done, then we could initiate the environmental or the NEPA review. And then we could move into finishing up our 30% design, our urban design work, and those sort of things that have been on hold as we've waited for or worked through finalizing the LPA. We'll also be evaluating the small starts information to see if there's ways that we can improve our rating as we would need to resubmit for another rating in August or September as well. So with that, just see if, I know it's a long presentation, a lot of information, but we'll see if there's any questions that folks have.
Okay, Brian, thank you, all of you. Can you put the screen of the 4 things you need to hear back from us on, please?
Yes.
That helps. Okay. Council members, if you will wave your hand, Ms. Ryan, followed by Mr. Boynsey.
Hi, everybody. Just to start to say, I'm so glad Weaver Dairy Road is narrowing. As somebody who's planted campaign signs there and almost lost my life running across that intersection, I'm really, really happy that's getting smaller. And I love the fact that we've got 85% coverage of multi-use paths along the route, so kudos to that. I've got a question about the South Columbia Highway 54 area down in there. I'm a little concerned by that 30-foot widening. And also that's such a complicated intersection. When can we expect to see a little more detail in what the route will look like down there?
Brian, I guess I can take a crack at answering that. So we do have design drawings prepared for that area. Understand your concerns that 30 feet sounds like a lot. Once we are able to share that information with you, and I'll defer to Matt and Brian on when that happens and how that happens. But I think you'll see that in reality, it doesn't look or feel like it's getting much wider. It's really just a function of where those buses have to pull over, but we can get you the drawings to increase your comfort level and get a better sense of what that will look like in actuality.
That would be great. I participated a lot in the Obie Creek discussions, and there was a lot of talk about of the movement through that corridor and how we get pedestrians and bikes safely through there. And it's a really complicated intersection. So I would just urge Brian that sooner rather than later, if we can get those design drawings out, that would be great.
Yeah, so we can share that with you. If not, well, it probably won't be tonight, but we can share that with you this week, so that way you all can see that. And as Julia noted, a lot of that is to allow not only the buses to work through there, but also the pedestrian movements and things like that would need to happen as well. But we can send you a picture of that, send you all a picture of that before the end of the week.
That would be great. And if you can post it online too, because I know there's a lot of community interest in that as well. And my second question is, in the TIAs that you have done, especially through downtown, have you considered the impacts of the proposed Rosemary deck? We have at least some preliminary TIA data on that now.
So we've taken into account the potential adjustments to Franklin Street for implementing the bike lanes, but the parking deck, TIA was just finished up. So we will utilize that work and have our consultants on this project talk with Dwight and their consultants that are working on the parking deck project as well, to make sure that we don't run into any challenges there. But we've not done that yet since that TIA is so new.
Yeah, okay, I don't know if that's gonna impact your the design decision going through downtown, but it looks like it's gonna be a lot of traffic and a lot of impact. So the sooner we can loop that in, the better. Thank you.
Alan, followed by anyone else? Michael, I don't see you on the screen. Hang on. I'm assuming you have a question. So Alan, followed by Michael.
All right. So I've got two questions. So my first one is about the partial convert scenario, particularly coming from, I guess, coming southbound. There's a drawing or a diagram that showed in that scenario, partial convert, I guess a bus only lane converting to mixed traffic. And I'm wondering, so I think we're at least that line, I think it's like designated by, the different colors, color blue and then green. I'm wondering at what point between, I guess it's Franklin Street and South Cameron Avenue, at what point would that bus only lane go into mixed traffic? I hope I'm making sense there.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. So the way that would work is it would likely be at some point mid-block between Franklin Street and Cameron Avenue. So the bus lane would continue up to a certain point, and then it would drop almost in a similar way to how it would work at some intersections where the bus lane sort of drops into a right turn lane at which, the regular vehicles could get into that lane to make a right turn at Cameron. So that's kind of how we've been modeling it and thinking about it to this point.
Got it. Yeah, I'm thinking, and this goes in line with what you were saying during the presentation, but I'm thinking that there, especially for folks coming in from out of town, there might be some confusion for drivers, in terms of when they can get over, to the right, and that lane. And I think you had mentioned something about, the importance of clear signage at that point. But yeah, I appreciate that clarification. Then
similarly, like in the northbound direction, you kind of have a similar challenge where, you'd have a bus lane sort of leading up to Cameron Avenue, and then, you would allow vehicles to use both lanes sort of through that core portion of downtown. But, it's a challenge to sort of let people know, hey, by the time you get up to Rosemary, it drops and becomes a bus lane again. So that is kind of the confusion that could result from an alternative like that. And that was the hesitancy in recommending it.
Gotcha. Thank you. And then my second question, I may be thinking about worst case scenario here. I'm thinking about a scenario where it's we're in downtown Chapel Hill, particularly around that intersection of Franklin and Columbia Street. And, I've been downtown on a home football game day, and there's just total gridlock, even with the existing lanes. And I'm wondering, for events like that where, we're drawing in so many people from really out of town, for an event, how we can manage that kind of gridlock if we have, either a fully converted bus lane or a partially converted bus lane, going through downtown, particularly on that stretch of Columbia Street, and then going past Franklin Street.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we've been talking about is the potential for being able to use that outside running bus lane for vehicles during special events or particular times of day. That's something that can be considered. If you want to be able to sort of reserve that bus lane for your normal typical days for peak hours to be able to prioritize that bus, but use that outside bus lane as if it were a regular lane during special events. That's something that can be implemented.
Got it. Great.
And would be, kind of vetted a little bit further as you get a little bit more into the nitty gritty of design.
Got it. Thank you.
We've talked about that a lot with the university. They've got their representatives also include athletics as part of the technical committee. So Councilmember Boynes, we've talked with them about that as a potential option as well too, because like you and most in council, they too are concerned about how that works during game days, basketball, football, and otherwise. And so that's something that we'll continue to develop ways to do that as we move into kind of that engineering and design phase.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
I don't have any questions. I can make some comments if you'd like.
Yes, please.
So a couple of things. First, I want to thank the team for, getting us this far. I mean, we're sort of getting so close to a BRT, I can practically not smell the diesel fumes because it'll be electric. But I'm really excited about this. And as I, never miss an opportunity to brag on ourselves and brag on Chapel Hill Transit, if we are successful in, getting this funded and built, we will be the smallest town in the United States with a BRT. So again, just one more way that we continue to punch above our weight. The other thing, I think Brian was being very polite and alluding to this earlier, but we really need to start making faster progress on this for two reasons. One, I think Brian talked a lot about Raleigh and where they are. They've already gotten to 30% design. And, while theoretically it's not a competition, in practicality, it probably is. And so we have to make sure that we don't lose our place in the queue. Secondly, as if what happened in the last recession, 08, 09 happens again, and there's an infrastructure component to some stimulus bill, they're going to be looking for shovel-ready projects. And so it really behooves us to try to move this along as quickly as possible so that we can be shovel-ready as soon as possible. So if there is stimulus money over and above the normal allocations for the federal Small Starts program, we want to be able to avail ourselves of it. We got that kind of funding for our fiber optic and for our traffic signals in 09. An armory was built in Raleigh with that money because it was shovel ready. So I think it's really important that we, make our decisions quickly and move this along as quickly as we can to really maximize our chance of getting this funded. We've done so much great work up till now. It would be, just a real shame if we can't push it across the finish line.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else? We need to move along. We have some time constraints on our other items. You can always send your comments in to Brian Litchfield and team. But I also appreciate the work that's been done to further dive into the details on this. And you listened when we asked, we don't want you to widen any of our curbs, that we felt like we were pretty wide across that whole corridor. And I love all the extra crosswalks. I think that's going to be huge and important. So I know there's some constraints on this plan because of the narrowness of downtown and the number of pedestrians. I think you've done a really good workaround on that too. All right. Do you have the information you need from us, Mr. Litchfield?
We do. Thank you. And we'll see you hopefully sometime in June for a final decision on the LPA. So thank you all.
Thank you. And make sure you post this for the public and let them know they can make comments, because we're not taking a vote tonight. We're just making comments. We will vote in June at the meeting. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move to our next topic, which is the East Rosemary proposed parking deck. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mayor. We are offering now an update to you on the East Rosemary Street parking garage / Grubb Properties office building proposal. I'll provide a general overview of the proposal. The town would exchange the Wallace parking deck and land on East Rosemary Street for the 137 parking deck. It's also known as the CVS parking deck, which is owned by Grubb, and any adjacent properties that are needed to build the garage. If approved, the town would build a new parking deck on that parcel consisting of approximately 1,100 parking spaces. 100 of those spaces would be reserved and paid for by the University of North Carolina to support its new admissions building in downtown, and 250 spaces would be reserved and paid for by Grubb Properties to support their projects along East Rosemary. And if approved, Grubb would in turn construct a new wet lab and office building of approximately 200,000 square feet with a projected value of about $80 million. And there would also be an expectation, of course, that hundreds of new jobs would be brought into our downtown, creating some new vibrancy in our downtown, especially on the eastern portion. So with that, I will hand over the presentation to Joe Dye from Grubb Properties.
Joe, you with us?
I'm here. I'm waiting for, I think, Amy to turn my video on, but I can go ahead and get started.
We also have Clay Grubb with us as well, folks. So we'll hear from him as well.
Yeah, so good evening, Mayor Heminger and Council. Pleased to be with you all tonight. As Mayor Heminger noted, Clay Grubb is with us tonight. Very pleased to introduce a couple other members, new members of the Grubb team, Jacob Manovich and Whitney St. Charles, who've just joined our commercial development team, and our lead architect, Michael Stevenson, whom you've all seen many times before. So I'm here to talk to you tonight about the economic development. And here's my video. Hello, everybody. Economic development and community benefits that we've talked about as we've gone through this process for the redevelopment on East Rosemary Street. So the main topics to talk about tonight that I want to cover is the new town-owned state-of-the-art parking deck, the new urban green spaces we've talked about as community benefits that come with these projects, the Rosemary Street streetscape improvements along that 100 block of Rosemary Street, and finally, the new lab office building at 150 East Rosemary Street. So to start, the new town-owned state-of-the-art parking deck, the key benefits here is it increases town ownership and control of parking downtown in keeping with town policy goals, provides enough parking density for the deck to be self-sustaining economically. I know Dwight and Amy will review that following this presentation. It consolidates parking central to the 100 block of East Rosemary Street, allowing for efficient redevelopment of this block. That includes the future building at the Wallace Deck site, but also Lot 2 owned by the town, and of course the north side of that 100 block of Rosemary Street. And then finally, as Maurice alluded to, the parking for the UNC Admission Center, which brings thousands of visitors annually to downtown in support of service, retail, and restaurant businesses in the downtown district. So moving on to the new urban green spaces, I know we spent a lot of time talking about these. The bottom image you see is the Nano Park or Urban Park that would be in the Lot 2 laydown area. That will be converted to an urban park with sidewalks connecting, or a sidewalk connecting Rosemary Street to Varsity Alley and Franklin Street. That provides a mid-block pedestrian connection from the new deck to Franklin Street when constructed. A new office building at 150 East Rosemary Street, the Wallace Deck site, will include the commitment to build a town green on the corner of Rosemary and Henderson Street. That's the image you see on the top of the slide. And upon completion, we plan to dedicate that to the town as a public open space. And then finally is the slide, or the, design has continued to evolve for the parking deck. And I know a lot of you have seen that. There's a 30-foot OWASA easement on the east side of the deck. And we're viewing that as an opportunity for a linear green space. It's a pedestrian connection from North Street to Rosemary Street, and then of course linking to downtown, as well as a pedestrian connection for folks coming down the back stairwell of the deck out to the public realm along Rosemary Street and other connection points from there. This is another familiar slide, I know to a lot of you. It's the Rosemary Street streetscape improvements. This is illustrating where there's an opportunity for bike lanes, improved sidewalks, and improved streetscape landscaping and other elements that would represent over 50% of that frontage. That's the deck, the redevelopment of the 136 East Rosemary building, the 150 East Rosemary building, the new wet lab office building, then these downtown green spaces that we highlighted in the earlier slides. So to summarize the investment in those community benefits, this slide is an illustration of that. You have the Lot 2 Urban Nano Park, the town green, the bike lanes, sidewalk improvements, and streetscape improvements total a little bit over $1.1 million of investments in those community benefits that come with the balance of these projects. Moving on, this is a view of the new office lab building at 150 East Rosemary Street. So you can see the current rendering of the design of 137 Franklin, 136 Rosemary on the right-hand side of the image at the bottom of the screen. And on the left-hand side, this is a design rendering or concept rendering of that new lab office building. So that's an opportunity for public-private innovation that we've talked a lot about. That's in downtown with beginning with the meaningful redevelopment of 137, 136, and again, the new building. It's the opportunity for that new Class A office wet lab building, 6 stories up to 200,000 square feet. It's a substantial impact for the tax base for downtown, and we'll get into that in just a second. And it's an attraction and retention of UNC and private businesses that brings hundreds of jobs to downtowns, and that has a ripple effect on other businesses downtown. And we have another slide that helps illustrate that. And last but not least, this is real important because it restores Chapel Hill to a better equilibrium with the overall Triangle office market. It's something Dwight and I have talked a lot about. I know you all have talked a lot about, and Mayor Heminger has been a great cheerleader for promoting Chapel Hill being open for business, and we want to help be part of that equation, bringing this much needed commercial space. So this slide is an illustration we thought would be helpful of what the scope and of that economic development is for this 150 East Rosemary office building. So here you see it compared to the Gwendolyn, the office building under construction now at Glen Lennox. So that building represents almost $40 million investment that for us has a stabilized return on cost. That's a basic metric of how we view the return on our investment in a property in a project like that. And then the 150 East Rosemary building you see on the right is substantially higher investment. It's a bigger building, but also a much more expensive building. It's a little over 100 million. It's a bit different from what Maurice said before, but having gone through this in a little more detail, it's a more expensive building. And you see it's also a little bit lower return on cost. So what we wanted to illustrate there is one, again, the scope of that investment, but also it's a little bit increased risk for us to take a lower return for a substantial investment in downtown. And then what you see here at the bottom of the slide is a summary of what that annual tax impact is based on the town's current tax rate. The Gwendolyn has an annual estimated tax revenue of a little over $115,000. And the 150 East Rosemary building upon completion would be a little over $217,000. And 137 Franklin, 136 Rosemary would be, as you can see, 136. So substantial tax base increase. Those are town taxes, so that does not account for Orange County taxes, the school tax, and the downtown service district, which are other sources of revenue for Chapel Hill and the local community. And then we thought this would be a good way to illustrate what are the impacts during construction by our construction workers that would work on these two projects over the next couple of years, and then the impact of those office workers that work in these buildings upon occupancy. So here for the 150 East Rosemary building, you see, and these are annual numbers. This is construction workers that are having breakfast and lunch on a typical workday. That impact is $93,000 to $117,000 a year, and projected impacts to downtown businesses, mainly restaurants. And then after completion, those office workers, and this is cumulative, they would have an impact in Chapel Hill and Orange County with their spending dollars of a little over 3.2 million, and in the immediate downtown neighborhood of just over $3 million, which is a substantial impact to downtown. Excuse me. And then similarly for the 137 and 136 East Rosemary buildings during construction, again, the construction employees would generate between 81,000 and 138 in annual revenue. And upon completion, the employees in that building would have impacts of a little over $1.9 million in Chapel Hill and Orange County, and a little over $1.8 million in the immediate neighborhood in downtown. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, we have Clay here. I know Clay has a hard stop at 8:30. So I encourage any questions you might have for me or Clay that we can talk about that now. Thank you.
Clay could just say hello and share a couple things with us. That would be welcome.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council for the Town Council for inviting us tonight to speak with you and to continue to work on this project. We think that this is a really rare opportunity to be able to truly change an area in downtown that we think has struggled recently, and certainly with the old Bank of America Plaza that we're currently renovating. That is a building that I think will be a substantial improvement, not to mention the ugly deck as we've talked about, and the fact that we can actually take advantage of what should be pretty substantial construction savings next year as a result of what is the crisis we're going to. We're seeing dramatic drops in commodities, as well as we anticipate that will be a fair amount of reduction in labor just because of the unemployment being so high. So we do think that that will result in us being able to build buildings for less money at a faster rate. And certainly all the businesses in downtown would greatly benefit from the enhanced environment. So we feel honored to be here and to be a part of this really unique opportunity, and look forward to discussing it further.
Clay, thank you for being with us tonight. And I want to go ahead and just put you on the spot if you're okay with that. A lot of council members have asked us what kind of assurances you can give us that you're actually going to build if we move forward, that you're actually going to build the 150 East Rosemary. I know that you can't give an absolute certainty, but can you give us your thinking behind what you've done to collect your investment pool and the outlook you see for the 150 East Rosemary?
Well, certainly, and for us also, it's a bigger question too. Is just what are we going to do with the 137 and 136? You know, we are trying to decide which direction to go. We had a plan that basically upgraded the building from what I'll call a Class C building to a Class B building. And then we've been pushed pretty hard by the university to really upgrade it to a true Class A building, which would be about an additional $12 million investment in that building. I do think that it makes more sense to do that additional investment if we're planning to do a second building, because this is be an atrium for the entry for both of these buildings coming off of Franklin Street. So I think that's an important component too, as we decide which way to go there. But, you know, as far as it goes for the next building, you know, we are not in the business of owning land. We don't bank land. We just don't do it. It's not something that we've done. We, you know, Glen Lennox is the closest thing, but it's always been an operating property. So, you know, our intention would be to build it. We have a substantial amount of equity raised from our 2019 Qualified Opportunity Fund. We have not allocated 50% of those dollars to date, but we're in the process of allocating them. And certainly in today's world, you know, the opportunity the opportunity pool has greatly increased as there's a lot less capital, and so there's more folks looking for capital. But, you know, we think that this is a very unique opportunity. You know, we can't predict what the world's going to be like, but I'm assuming that the university will reopen. They may not reopen in the fall, but certainly they'll reopen sometime within the next year. And the research that's going on today has been greatly accelerated. And so the idea of having wet labs in downtown is really exciting. And we're not going to be somebody who just sits on the land, and 10 years from now you go, why do you still have that land and haven't done anything? You know, we will be reporting to you regularly our progress and explaining to you why we haven't started if we haven't.
Thank you for sharing with that. All right, council members, do you have questions at this point, or do you want to wait and see all the financial numbers? If someone wants to have a question, if you will raise your hand and I will call on you. Not seeing anyone raising their hands. All right, let's continue on with the presentation then. Oh, Hong Bin, you have to unmute yourself. There you go. Go ahead.
Just a clarification question. So I think that we have heard the different versions of the plan for this green space connecting the Rosemary and the Franklin Street, connecting that through Varsity Alley. What is the current plan? Is the Grubb probably going to construct that park, or they're going to just give a payment in lieu, or what is the current plan? I have heard different versions of the plan, just not sure that what's the current version.
I'll answer that, Hong Ben. I don't think it's been current. If that's been unclear, apologize for that. The idea is we'd always restore that land. So lot 2 will be used for a laydown area during construction of the deck, the renovation of 136 Rosemary, and potentially some of the construction duration of 150 East Rosemary. And then our commitment is to restore that area back to the nano or urban park that we talked about. So that's grading that land. We'll probably need some semblance of a retaining wall, building a paver path or sidewalk path from Rosemary Street to Varsity Alley. And our current budget has in it some site furnishings, some benches, bike racks, and some trash receptacles that would complete that green space.
Okay, so you're going to construct that.
Yes, that's right.
That area.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that okay? I can talk more to our town staff, maybe Brian, to talk about that, the green space as well, because I haven't heard the plan for that space, but thank you for the clarification.
You're welcome.
Okay, let's continue on with the presentation, please.
So the next part of the presentation is a review of the finances, and the first slide will be a review of the high-level fee projected costs that we believe we'll see in the parking deck, and then I'll turn it over to Amy to go over several specific projections on financing the deck itself. So I'd like to be very specific with council. This is a very high-level look at the deck cost and then potential amenities that you might be interested in adding to it. We're first glance. This is not a hard bid. We have been working with Joe and his team to come up with some high-level costs. We have just now retained an oversight consultant, and I would certainly not want to finalize these until that consultant has looked at these numbers, but we at least wanted to give council some clarity as to sort of where we are. If you look at this top section, these are all the numbers that we've used throughout all of the projections that Amy's talked about. This 27,300,000 is the number that we talked about, and it comes from these numbers up here at the top, which were projected deck costs from McAdams and Metromont in 2019 for the West End deck. So we know they're fairly recent. There will be some changes because of the economy. And then this top figure also includes the construction management, the land swap, and that arrives at that figure that we've been using up to this point in time. Then we tried to associate some numbers with other things that we've talked about, and I'm going to walk through them just briefly. Car charging, this is a amount that John Richardson and Meg McGurk gave me from the last time we added charging to 140 West. We paid about $6,500 each for the charging station. So I'm just projecting at this point that we might look at 2 or more. There's certainly a room in the deck to add as many as we'd like. Laura Selmer has been working with Grubb team on the solar. This is a midpoint range for the PV array on top of the deck. There's a tremendous number of options in there that could go from having some of our car charging associated with solar on that top level, and they go directly to the car charging stations, all the way to leasing and variable options that we're looking at. So we're not at a firm price. This is that midpoint price at this point in time for the solar. And then the town has traditionally put 1% of a project into public art, and that would be $273,000. We believe that new sidewalks and streetscapes that would need to be redone as a part of building the deck would cost about $50,000. Some traffic and road improvements, whether those are curb cuts or other things, could come in around $25,000. And then there's been a tremendous amount of discussion about changes to the building facade from CDC to town council. And so we've worked with Michael Stevenson to develop a range, and we think between design fees and actual materials that you could spend somewhere between $800,000 and 1.6 on materials and changes to the exterior of the building. The office space that we've talked about, and these are 2 separate, and they're actually broken out separately, but I combined them as one. So if you decided that you only wanted to do parking management at the deck, then that fee would be reduced. But if you do the substation and parking, it would be this $448,000 here. Public toilets are about $20,000 per toilet. So this would allow for 2 toilets on the first floor. We have to relocate the sewer, as you've heard us talk about the easement on behalf of OWASA. And there's a cost of about $350,000 to relocate that sewer line. And then if we decide we want to go forward with a exit onto Columbia, we believe the land value for that exit would be about $500,000. And we're hoping the access to North Street could be an easement. And we're presuming that that would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000. So if you opted to go with all the amenities in this chart, your cost would go from this 27.3 that Amy's talked about all along, and she'll be sharing more information on what $1 million adds to your financing costs. But if you went for all of this, then you would go to about $29,900,000. And again, these are high-level numbers. It was meant to give council some idea of what various aspects of this parking deck that you might want to add or change might cost, and so that you could begin thinking through what your priorities might be. And I'll let Amy pick up on this slide.
Actually, Dwight, if you'll go back just 1 second, please.
Okay.
I've had a lot of council members ask me today about the charging stations, and I want to remind folks that we can always put a lot of conduit in for charging stations. It's not that much more costly to do so. And then we've been really successful in getting grants from Duke Energy to install those charging stations. As long as we put conduit in, it gives us the opportunity to expand and to get some free charging stations. We know that's going to be a need in the future. The staff was just trying to give you all a sense of how much they cost, and we could add more if we want to go ahead and purchase them. But I think this council would like to know from the staff a recommended number of charging stations for a deck of this size, and whether you do them on multiple floors or all on the first floor. So I'll just put that out there because I know you're going to get that question several times because I got it all day long. So that's an opportunity there, just so folks know. That the staff wasn't recommending that we only do 4 charging stations. They were recommending letting you know what the cost was going to be.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good evening, Mayor and Council. So the last time we came before you to provide some financial projections was February 19th. Since that time, we have updated financial numbers and recognized that it was time to come back and provide this update. What we have for you today is 2 scenarios. This first one is what I'll call kind of a standard scenario. It's a scenario based on occupancy numbers that we feel pretty comfortable in. And then we have a second scenario that is a little bit more conservative. So we wanted to provide those 2 options so that you can see the differences based on varying occupancy rates. So I'll walk you through. There's a lot of information on the screen, so I'm going to try and just quickly walk through what is presented here. What we did was we provided a 10-year projection here, and then a total column that's all the way on the right, and that represents the full 20 years that we would be borrowing for this deck. But we wanted the spreadsheet to be able to be readable, and if I put the 20 years, it wouldn't have been able to read. So what we have is starting at the beginning, I will say that what is built into this projection, and we'll talk a little bit more about the parking fund and the sustainability of the parking fund in the next item when we provide an update on the fiscal year 20 and 21 budget preparation. We have built into this model something that we've talked with council about since the beginning of the project, is the need to increase our fee structure to be able to accommodate this project. We talked about providing a consistent rate schematic and recognized that we had 2 decks and lot 2 that had a different hourly rate. And so this is built into the assumption that at some point next year, we would raise the hourly rate to $1.50. And we would at the same time increase our parking rate to 125. It is currently 115. So that helps make the model feasible. So you see that in the first row, the $125 rate for leased parking. We are attributing 225 spaces for leased, and that's what we're going into this projection looking at. Occupancy, we feel very comfortable that we could get 100% occupancy. We know that we have a waiting list or have historically had a waiting list, and so feel good about projecting at that 100%. Next, we have overleases. So this is a very common market practice, is to overlease spaces, and based on usage, it's a way to maximize the profitability of the deck. And so we've computed a revenue for that. Overnight leases, we've talked with council about changing the way we structure our leases and looking at 12-hour leases instead of a 24, or also providing a 24, but then giving a 12-hour lease option. And so this amount represents what we're looking at for providing an evening lease. And so the total is highlighted there in yellow. If you look at that first year, fiscal year 22, important to note is that we're projecting 1/2 year of revenues for 22 based on when we think the deck will open and begin operating. So that's why you see 22 is about half of the other line items. At the same time, for our leased parking space, we have projected an increase every approximately 3 years. We're providing a rate increase built into this structure of $5. And that's projected out throughout that leased scenario. For the hourly spaces, we are using 525 spaces for that model and projecting that out using a 65% occupancy. And for the leased occupancy, we are also projecting an increase of about 2% every year up to, well, 5% once the office building opens up, and then 2% every year going up to 90%, and it caps at 90%. And looking at that revenue, you'll see that highlighted in green. We also have projected out the 250 spaces that Grubb has committed to, and projected out the market rate increase that we have above for our leased spaces. We are showing the UNC deck maintenance commitment. So they've committed to providing an allocated maintenance amount per year to help keep those spaces upkept. And then so total revenues, you'll see there, that represents the sum of all the leased revenue and the hourly revenue, the commitment from Grubb and the commitment from UNC. The deck operating expenses, that's based on $440 per space, and that's a market standard that we had shared with us, and we have provided a 3% inflationary increase there per year. The debt service related to the deck. So this we talked about, and this relates back to what Dwight was talking about earlier. So this was when we first calculated the debt service based on 28.5 million. And that was based on the construction cost that Dwight showed, the 27.3, plus at the time we didn't have the appraisals back. So now that we have appraisal, the amount that we were showing for the land difference or exchange was higher. So now we have a lower amount, but now we've built in other pieces related to the additional exit. And so there are some additional costs. So this is still based on the 28.5 million. So I'll talk about in the next 2 slides what it does to our cash flow if we add in additional amount for us to have to borrow, and what that does to our debt service payments and our cash flow. And so cumulative cash flow, you'll see net cash flows. So also important to note that the reason that you see such a large negative cash flow in the first year is because we will only have operating revenues for 1/2 year, but we will have to make a full debt payment that first year. So that kind of drives that. But you'll see that based on these projections, the project has a net cash flow positive after that first year of operations it does take us a few years to get past that cumulative negative cash flow. One of the things we've talked about is that we are expecting to receive $2.4 million from UNC for the construction costs. They're going to pay upfront the cost of constructing the 100 spaces that they will be using. And so we could use that 2.4 that they'll be providing upfront to help us get through those first few years of negative cash flow. Dwight, do you want to move forward? Thank you. So with the second projection, the more conservative projection, the layout is the same as in the previous projection. The most notable differences are that we are conservatively estimating an 85% occupancy rate and holding that flat. And then showing a 55% occupancy for hourly when we first open, and then increasing that by 5% when the office building is projected to open, and then 2% thereafter throughout up to 90%. So you can see in this model, the difference is that it takes a few more years for us to show a positive net cash flow. That won't happen until 2026, and then a bottom line net cash flow positive until 2030. Again, even at the highest point where we are in the negative, it's only 1.7 million. So we are also thinking that we could use the model and say that the UNC 2.4 million would help buy us through those first few years until we could get into the positive cash flow stream. Dwight. So as I talked through the assumptions that are built into this, the revised fee structure that we would need to look at beginning next year, the market adjustment of our rates, and we would evaluate obviously what's happening in the market and look at, does that seem feasible and is it the right time to be increasing those rates? The 5% occupancy growth once the office is constructed and 2% thereafter until about 90%. That first year being a half year of revenue projection when the deck is projected to open. Again, this uses a principal borrowing of 28.5. We're assuming 3% interest for the 20-year period and 3% inflationary growth. So we wanted to also talk through, there are some assumptions built into these models that, you know, might change once we get a little bit further through and we determine how much we'll actually be borrowing, and that'll be based on conversations that council has. And once we get to market and what the interest rate looks like, we know that interest is really good right now. So the 3% is really probably conservative. So if we look at adding $1 million to the amount that we talked about, the 28.5, just to give you an idea, it's an additional $330,000 in interest over the life of the project. The $1 million obviously of principal. So the annual payment that we'd have to add to the total debt service that you saw in the previous projections is about $80,000 a year. That will go down over the years as interest decreases. The principal payment will be $50,000. That holds firm because we do level principal throughout the borrowing, but the interest payment will decrease over the 20-year period. If we look at a 0.25% reduction in the interest rate, that means that over the life of the borrowing, there'd be about $783,750 less in interest, which is a $71,000 reduction in annual payments the first years. And again, over the life of the loan, as we pay less interest, that amount would also decline in terms of reduction. And that is all we had to share. Does council have any questions that they want to ask at this time?
Thank you for working on those numbers. I know we sent you late breaking suggestions and you incorporated them, so appreciate that. If you have a question, council members, Amy, do you want to put the first screen back up, the cost of building the deck? We can start with that one, and if council wants to jump back and forth the other ones, they can then do that. So I saw Amy Ryan, followed by Michael Parker, followed by Hong Min Gu.
Okay, so do you want, I guess my first question is, right now we're counting on a $2.4 million upfront payment for UNC. And that's a university that's looking at maybe not opening this fall. How confident are we that that would come through, or do we need to prepare for an eventuality where they're not prepared to do that?
So I've been in communication with Gordon Merkeline. We have actually drafted a letter of intent, and sometime in the next week or two, I presume, we will present that letter of intent to the university to begin pursuing the actions they need to take to commit or not commit to those spaces. So our goal is that by the time we get to the last public hearing on the EDA, if we continue to move forward, that we would have some direction from the university prior to that final agreement. We would know exactly how to advise council.
Okay, thank you. Another question, are we digging down at all when we build this deck, or is the floor level staying the same?
We are going down, but it's only on the end of the deck adjacent to PNC. There is a good bit of contingency in the budget right now, and we're hoping that we will come close to covering that. We won't know until the land is under contract and we are able to do soil borings. And we certainly are moving toward that. Joe and I have been communicating about that for weeks, but he can't take that action until he has control of the fine property. So we hope to know more about that in the coming weeks.
Okay, because I think that's something, I know that people who've built in that area have been stung there before. So just want to make sure that that you're covering that. So I'm happy to hear that that's okay. I see that the EDA has us paying Grubb Properties $30,000 a month to lease the Wallace deck while we're still running it before they build. Does that cover our expenses?
So that was a negotiated amount from when we were last talking to council. And we believe, based on the fact that we will be converting the Wallace stack to 100% hourly rate, and based on what hourly generates annually, we believe that, our early projections is that our income for the Wallace stack could go up anywhere from 50% to 100% because of the increased demand and converting all the spaces to hourly. So our early projections make us feel pretty comfortable that that is a reasonable amount, and we still have sufficient income to cover maintenance, operation, and everything needed to make that an effective operating deck.
Okay.
Amy, do you have any comment? Olin?
I mean, I think all of this, I think that is fair. And I think the only thing to note, and I think this has, been on everyone's mind, is that right now we are not charging in order to help businesses downtown. At some point, we will have to go back to a charging model. But in that interim, that would be the only period that I'm concerned about not bringing in revenues, but having this commitment.
Okay. And again, Mr. Grubb, I appreciate you addressing your interest in getting this building built, and assume that's all going to happen. But I'm concerned, or I just want to make sure that the town is doing what it can do to mitigate the risk. So have you guys run a spreadsheet if something happens and that office building doesn't get built and Mr. Grubb doesn't lease those spaces from us?
So we have not, we have discussed putting a deadline of time that he would need to complete the building and start paying for the parking places, meaning once he has entitlement, 18 to 24 months completion, and then he would need to start paying. And that's, what we believe that we would be doing, whichever building is occupied first, either 137, 136, or the new office building. And we're continuing to have conversation about beyond just the parking payment, about what that would mean if Grubb did not proceed. But right now, Bob Jessup can talk more about what we're talking about in the economic development agreement related to when they would start paying for that parking.
Okay, I just want us to know what that worst case scenario might look like, just to make sure that that we understand what we're committing to. Okay, thank you.
Michael Parker, followed by Han Bingu.
Yeah, so first I want to thank Amy and Dwight and all the other folks who have worked on putting this together. I think that, I recognize that these are projections, and the one thing, one can be absolutely certain of is that the reality won't turn out exactly as your projections indicate, and that's fine. But it is comforting to know that I think under some fairly, even under some fairly unpleasant alternatives, eventually, this does pay for itself, and that the hole that we might have to take on, is manageable. I think, the worst case scenario is that we would have a cumulative net, negative of about 1.7 million. And so what I did want to ask though, a couple of things is, between now and when we would presumably execute the economic development agreement and actually start moving ahead with all of this, how much more certainty can we get about the construction costs? Right now, they're still, as you acknowledged, fairly high level, reasonably high level estimates, and that's perfectly fine. But at some point, we're going to need to make sure that these are the real numbers. So when do you expect to have these fully vetted by whomever, so that when we make a final commitment and sign the EDA, we really can be very confident in the numbers?
So I think we can go through some level of vetting prior to the EDA being at its final consideration at the second public hearing with council if you continue to move forward. But those numbers will continue to change. We're presuming that final bid cost may not come in till late July, early August. And again, we want our oversight consultant to vet those numbers and help us make sure we're getting the absolute best for our money. And we also have to do that as a part of the LGC for Amy to be able to go out and borrow the dollars. So again, we're in May. We think in the next 4 weeks, as council gives us more clarity on expectations, we can come closer to reality of knowing what those costs are. Hopefully we can complete the borings and know what's in the ground underneath there and know whether our contingency is sufficient. So I think that we can be fairly close by the time we come back near the end of June if you continue to progress. Joe certainly can perhaps add any comments, but at this point, from my view, we've hired an oversight consultant. We're doing the things that we need to do our best for the town and make sure we get the best value.
Second is, I was just wondering, Amy talked a couple of times about using the 2.4 million from UNC to sort of cover the cash hole for the first couple of years of the project. Might it not be a better use of the funds, assuming we can find cash elsewhere, to just put that into the project and borrow $2.4 million less and therefore reduce the debt service and the interest payments over time? I mean, I'm not sure why you would take $2.4 million, but then borrow it.
I think that our interest in following that path is because one, timing of the 2.4 million, we don't know what that 100% looks like, but also our real cash flow needs based on our projections are really at the front end of the project. So we really need help passing that hurdle. At this time, we don't have other funds that we can identify to help us with that. So the other piece of that is we could always, once we hit a certain point in the borrowing, we could pay additional back on that loan if we were in a position and wanted to do that. This is all coming out of the enterprise fund, and hopefully, our model shows that this will be self-sustaining, so we have a little bit more flexibility with that. But really, it's these first few years that we need that buffer, and based on the sustainability of the parking fund at this time, we really need that $2.4 million buffer to just help us get past this maybe 3-year hurdle. And I think the parking fund will be in a much better shape at that point.
Okay, well, that's all I have. I think, we've made a lot of progress, and certainly, with each passing week, I'm getting more and more comfortable with this. So thank you, everybody.
Mr. Grubb.
Yeah, I just want to jump back real quick to Amy's question related to the Grubb commitment for the parking. That is a commitment that is not tied to whether we build the building or not. So it's gonna be a real penalty for us if we're paying for parking and we don't have a new building for people to park. So that is definitely one of the carrots or sticks that the town has negotiated to make sure we're motivated to get the building built.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Thank you. That's a good clarification. All right, Hung Bin Gu. Oh, Joe, sorry, did you want to add into that?
Well, I just wanted to follow up on some of the construction cost statements since we have it still on the screen. One, our sustainability associate is a gentleman named Colin Walker, and he's working with town staff on the PV solar array on the roof. So we've identified that as a line item cost here, but we're hoping that there's alternative financing or subsidies available. So that would be, zero cost to the town, but still delivered as part of that. And in our design presentation later, I know a lot of you have asked to see that, and we have a rendering showing what that looks like on the roof. And then Dwight spoke to the car charging stations similarly in that regard. And then the exterior improvements, the $800,000 to $1.6 million. Right now, the design that you all have seen is in the $900,000 to $1 million end of that range. So just to know what that current design is getting you in that scope of cost. And the last is the conversation around the office space, the police substation, and the parking management in the deck. That's really important for us to continue the design of the deck, and that gives us a lot better information to refine these numbers. I feel really comfortable with these numbers today. We've had a lot of good background information that Dwight and I have shared with our contractor Samet that's been able to help provide a lot of these numbers and vet those numbers. If we can move forward with the design on the office component, I don't know if that gets decided here tonight. I don't think this is a decision meeting, but we certainly need that direction to help further the design so we can help work on these costs for you all and really get those dialed in.
Thank you. I have Hung Bin, followed by Jess Anderson, followed by Karen Stegman. And Ty, I need to find you if you're out there. All right.
Okay, so my first question, just the slides that's on the screen now. I'm not seeing any budget for like the bike parking or the multimodal paths along the Rosemary Street that we have talked earlier. Is that included or is it not under consideration? What's the situation for those bike parking within the parking deck structure as well as the bike lanes or multimodal lanes along the Rosemary Street?
So the bike parking is currently considered included. That's not a huge cost factor. The multimodal is a completely different subject, and I don't know that we can answer that. Joe, can you address anything related to the multimodal path at this point?
I think starting with the bike parking, that's always been integrated in the deck from day one, and Michael can show you when he goes through that design presentation where that exists in the deck. I think we have some great opportunities for that and at different locations that makes it useful. And I know we've showed that streetscape slide quite a bit, and that's really providing those bike lanes similar to what you have on West Rosemary Street. It's continuing that on that frontage. I know there's some dialogue about is that appropriate or not. I know the Downtown Partnership has a different view. We've got that in terms of our overall budget for our projects. So these costs reflect building the deck, and then what we would deliver with the Nano Park, the renovation of 136, and the future office building is that striping along that section of street that provides the bike lane separation for that 100 block.
So you're saying that you're confirming that these are being included in the budget that we are seeing now?
It's included in our budget. This is really what it takes just for the town to build the deck. So our commitment is to bring those bike lanes to that block. This is what it's the town's cost to build the deck, separate from our project commitment to bring the bike lanes to that 100 block, if that makes sense.
So that the parking spaces is included in this budget?
Yes, that's been in our design from day one.
Okay, good. Then Amy, can you switch to the next slide? This with the detailed projections. Yeah. So for this one, so here for the hourly, so there are one is for the monthly parking, and then Then there is this hourly parking scenarios that you have included here. So the number of hourly parkings you're projecting at 525 spaces, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so that is the total number of hourly parking spaces that's available.
Yes,
right?
that is correct. Available.
So the occupancy rate is the 65%. Is that our assumption for how many hourly parking spaces that will be used?
That is correct.
This parking deck is being built.
Yes.
Okay, so is that 65% is assume that it will cover the whole entire period during the daily operation for what, 12 hours?
Yes. That's
Okay.
during the day hours that we charge for hourly parking.
Okay, is that so that will translate into around, I don't know, what's 350 spaces? I don't know, 365.
Are you saying in terms of the 525, if we assume that 65% of them are occupied?
Yes.
That's 341.25.
341.
Mhm.
Okay. So that is, have we considered, I remember read the document that's generated by our consultants. They're saying that because of we are proposing the increase of our hourly rate, so they're expecting there is some reduction in the number of spaces that can actually being used for the hourly parking.
Well, I will say that the $1.50 is more than what we're currently charging in the Wallace and the Lot 2 and the CBS Ugly Duck, whatever you want to call that. But it is consistent with what we're charging elsewhere. And we did not see any kind of impacts in those lots. So I think it's obviously always possible that it could impact, but I think that people park with convenience in mind. And so that will help inform the decision making that the parker makes. So I think that based on the data that we had that Dwight was able to pull as he was working with the parking staff, we felt pretty comfortable that this model was reasonable to make these assumptions.
Well, okay, well, I don't know what kind of data that you have, but I'm just reading this document that's included in our packet, which is provided by our consultant. They're projecting a number that's lower than the ones that you're projecting here. I'm just reading the document that's provided by the town staff.
So if you're talking about the parking assessment we did in March, his overall conclusion is that we can easily, with elasticity, support the added spaces on East Rosemary because of demand in the market. And that was, the biggest takeaway. There were a number of council questions asked about that report in the council questions. And we feel pretty confident that that report reinforces the fact that this deck can be built and absorbed from a parking demand standpoint and be successful.
So what kind of data that you're referring to that will help us to, or help you to draw the conclusion that we're confident that we will be able to reach those numbers, especially given the documents that you provided to us that generated by our consultant has the number that's lower than the one that you are presented here.
I'm satisfied that council listened to your TIA at the CCES and the 2018 parking counts that he referred to in that TIA. Rosemary Street lots were occupied at 85 and 90% in that parking count. So we feel as reasonably conservative as we can with the 65%, given the last time we counted those uses, they were at 85 and 90, that we're still being fairly reasonable with our expectations.
Okay, well, I don't know what kind of data that you're referring to. If you can share the data with us that is different from this, the report generated by our consultant, I would like to take a look at it, because so far I haven't seen what's the justifications for the number that you shown over here. But I'm open. If you have different sets of number, I would be open to take a look at that. I'm just comparing these two sets of reports and see, and just pointing out they're different.
So the Rod Stevens report again gave us the confidence to believe that our projections were reasonable and that we could absorb the parking into our system. And the parking counts I'm referencing are included in the TIA itself. I'm also glad to send the Excel spreadsheets for those hard data counts that came with that parking, but it is referenced and the chart is displayed in the TIA.
TIA analysis for the traffic, is that what you're saying? Is that the
Yes.
traffic analysis?
Yes.
So so are you referring to the traffic analysis, traffic data analysis that we examined last week?
Yes.
That one?
Yes.
Well, it doesn't have the full day of how many occupancy rate there is. There is only the peak hour. That's for the traffic impact analysis. They only care about the peak hour. It doesn't have the full day occupancy count.
Again, I'm glad to provide the Excel spreadsheet where we did that parking count back in 2018 to the full council to examine it.
Oh, okay, great. Again, I'm saying that I'm open to review whatever the data that you have in addition to the report that just provided in our packet. I'm just pointing out the discrepancy in the assumptions that are being made in these two sets of analysis.
Well, and if I could just add one thing, I will say that some of the analysis that we've done is based on actual revenue collection and backing back into what is the occupancy. I know one of the things we've talked about is, we've had some difficulty over the years getting good parking data reports out of our system. We have a new system now. We're working on developing some better reporting so that we can actually have data to refer back to when we talk about things like this and making projections. And so we were able to project back based on the actual revenues to determine what occupancy numbers were. So as we were doing that, those occupancy numbers, and I understand that there's peak hours and off-peak hours, but the average does support these numbers in our most heavily used parking areas, one of which is Rosemary, the lot 2, and then 140, as we were looking at what those average occupancy rates look like.
Yeah, can you share those revenue data? Because I think I have requested that at least 2 months ago when we sit together to talk about what's the reasonable assumption for the occupancy. And I think I requested at that time and I haven't seen that yet.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought that was shared, but we can go back and share.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Jess Anderson, followed by Karen Stegman, followed by Tywin.
Thank you all. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So my first question is about kind of I guess you called it the improved building. That was the 800,000 to 1.6 million. Yeah, thank you. That was the range there. So first of all, what is built into the total? So you have to take $30 million. Which number is factored in there?
So at this point in time, we're factoring no improved building number, and that's why it's blank. So this 29.9 is without additional costs that can come with finishes and materials that we end up selecting for the building. And this is meant to be a menu down here. This lower portion is a menu for council to give us sort of directive at some point in the future on what your priorities are so that we know where we should put those dollars.
Okay, understood. Well, I do know that we've gotten a lot of feedback from the community, from folks who are very excited about the project, but still are concerned about the facade or the appearance. So I think it's going to be really important for us to talk about this as a more expensive project, just because I don't think any of us are going to be comfortable with the base with the base scenario.
Right.
And so on a related note, when you have that range between 800,000 and 1.6 million, what are we talking about? So 800,000 gives me what?
So I'll ask Joe to address this, but if I understood him correctly, we're spending about 900,000 on the current building design that you'll see at the end of this presentation tonight.
Okay.
So, you know, if you want to step it up from there, or you want to remove something or change something, then that will affect those numbers. Joe, am I correct in that assumption?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a broad range. The top end of that range is masonry heavy. So that's a lot of brick, a lot of columns, that real finished building look, if you will. And then the lower end of the range is obviously down to a base deck. Where we're at, as I understand it, from our current pricing vetting today, we're about $9 to $950. So the renderings and the you've seen to date from Perkins and Will are in that range, if that helps.
So we're talking about a 30,900,000 deck, correct? What you're going to show us.
Is that a fair assumption? If council, I mean, some of these aren't going to be reflected in design at this point, and some of them would. We're assuming the toilets would be. We don't know what council's interest is on whether you have, and there are design options that Michael will show you as he goes through his design presentation.
That's great, Ben. If we're going to get to it, that's fine. If you all could just really walk us through it and tell us kind of what the options are.
Yes.
Because this is not something that I will know as you talk. When you talk about a green wall versus a facade versus masonry, I won't know what that cost is. So if you can just, as you talk us through that, talk about those costs, that would be really helpful, because I do think, right now we're at 30 million, but I do feel like we're going to be asking for more than that. So let's just really be mindful of that. My next question, I guess, was on something that you are asking for feedback on, which is the office space and the police substation. So I believe that the last time we talked about this was presented to us as an option. And my question then and my question now, and you may be addressing this later in the presentation, so if you are, just tell me to hold on. My question here is, what are our alternatives? It sounds like the current office for the parking office is right now in the Wallace deck. And so if that goes away, it needs to go somewhere.
That's correct.
But
So
what are my policy alternatives in terms of where that goes, and why do I want it here versus somewhere else? So that's the question, given that maybe there's somewhere else that it can go where there's existing office space that would make it much less costly. Or maybe you really feel like it really should be here because this is going to be a huge deck. It's going to be right downtown, and you want people right there to be able to assist people who are having trouble with the machine or whatever. I mean, I'm not telling you an opinion. I'm just asking why I want it here versus somewhere else, and what are the options for other places. And I guess similarly with the substation, same question. I don't have an objection to having a police substation there. I think it's a great idea to have one right downtown. I just don't know what my other alternatives are and what that would cost. And if I can save money and still have like a reasonable place to have the police substation, then why do I want it here?
Right. So just roughly, the parking office is about 170 of the 448, and then the balance of that is the police substation. We want a parking office and storage there, and we're exploring conversations about police substations.
Okay, so then I guess when we talk about this again, or at some point, it would be really helpful to know what the options are in terms of location of these things, and why I would want to pay for new space here or impact the design here when it could be somewhere else. So I'm not saying I'm opposed to it. I just want to understand why it's going here versus somewhere else. Or is it just like, we're building something, so we should just put it here, versus like this actually makes the most sense, and we've looked at all the other places it could go. I need it to be here, or there's nowhere else in proximity, or whatever that is. I would just love to hear kind of the justification, and maybe you all will get to the point as you go through the process where you recommend that we don't do it here. I don't know, but it looks like it's, you know, $500,000. So that's not everything, and it's not nothing.
Right.
So that would be great.
Yes, can I follow on that? I think, Dwight, it would be helpful, and Amy, if you would break out parking, office here and police substation so we can see. I know that building them together would reduce the overall cost, but it'd be nice to know that we're not saying, nope, we can't afford 448, so you're not getting either. I think it'd be nice to break them separately, line item.
We've certainly got it broken out. It's about 170 for the parking office, and then the balance of that 448 is police substation.
So I think that's just helpful to, yeah.
Yeah, that would be
Square
helpful.
footage, what square footage you're thinking for each one, just in a parentheses or something?
Well, and that's in Michael's design presentation also.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. And then you may recommend that we do one and not the other. So
Absolutely.
I'm just asking for the justification for why they're there. And then my last question is in terms of the maintenance commitment from UNC. If I'm remembering correctly, it looked like it was about $40,000 a year, with the first year prorated to half for half a year, so $20,000. And I'm just wondering, again, because I don't know parking decks, what does that mean that as maintenance costs go up over time, that the $40,000 a year kind of in the early years won't really all be used, and then you kind of push that into later costs? Or should their maintenance commitment be going up over time?
So we've taken standardized average construction nationally, maintenance costs nationally from Walker Parking, who came and presented to you several months ago, and then looked around to see what others are spending in Durham and Raleigh. And so we feel it's just better whether we spend it or not, since it's an enterprise fund, to keep that money set aside, even if we don't. I mean, if you've just completed the deck, obviously there's probably not a couple $100,000 worth of maintenance needed to be done. But there is upkeep, you know, whether that's just cleaning or pressure washing or whatever. So it is partially a reserve buildup, but it's also ongoing maintenance to keep the deck in tip-top shape.
Okay, so does that mean that I'm understanding you to say that some of it, you know, yes, certainly there are annual costs at the beginning, but they're not $40,000 worth.
That's
and
right.
so then you're kind of accumulating somewhere over time to compensate for the fact that as time goes on, things need more and more maintenance.
Yes.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Erin, followed by Ty.
Thanks. I just have two clarifying questions. The first one is about this budget we're looking at here. Does that include in the sort of basic deck cost, the retail porch construction?
Yes.
Okay, so that's already baked into it.
Yes, it absolutely is.
Okay. My second question is, I know at some point we had talked about the body that does this approving, whose name I can't remember right now, our ability to borrow this money for this purpose, that we would need to get this approved.
LGC.
Local Government Commission, yeah.
Thank you, thank you. Where are we with that, and when does that happen, and how long does that take?
Yeah. So we have had another conversation with the Local Government Commission to provide an update. You know, the last time we went to them was at the very beginning of the project, when the structure of the project looked a little bit different, the financing structure. So we provided an update and talked to them about where we are. Things are looking good. We are working on getting all of the steps taken care of to pave the way for once council authorizes to move forward. So there's only so much we can do until we get council's go ahead on the project. But we would be, we're lining everything up now so that once we get approval and get those final cost estimates in August, that we would be ready to sell in September. So we have a tentative sell date. We have everything lined up so that this can happen as long as we get the go forward from council.
There's no reason to think that won't go through, so we're not.
Yeah, right. No, I
We're
think we're good. Based on conversation with them, they felt they felt really good about the project and how things were lining up. And so, yeah, no, I don't
Great.
think there's any concerns.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And as I want to add my thanks, this has been a really helpful way to see the numbers. This slide and the 30-year projection, really helpful. So thank you.
All right, Ty, did you have something to share? And then Alan?
Yeah, Jess asked most of my questions. So I think I only have one left. The $1.3 million community benefit slide, is that already spelled out in writing in the economic development agreement, or will that be for the entitlement process?
You're going to be looking at the economic development agreement next week. That's not part of the deck numbers for tonight. They're still working on negotiations. They were just trying to present some things that they were thinking about, and you're going to be doing a deeper dive into that next week.
So Bob Jessup's actually here to run through the summary of the economic development agreement after this financial part.
All right.
All right, bet. Thanks.
All right, Alan?
So I had a question. This is related to our discussion a couple of weeks ago about the deck, and just kind of touched on this in talking about the parking office space and the police substation. But I remember during that discussion we had talked about, where in the deck, we'd be interested in having, those kinds of spaces. I think. I apologize if I'm misremembering, but I think Karen had mentioned, maybe if there's a police substation or parking office space, it could be to the rear of the deck versus the front of the deck. And I think we had asked about what kind of cost implications that might have in terms of where those kinds of spaces might be in the deck, and wondering if we have any information at this point about cost differentials for having the office space in the rear or to the front of the deck.
So we've got the base assumptions that we're sharing with you tonight, and I'm glad to break those out per the two uses. Michael Stevenson will be showing you in his design slides location options, but generally thinking the numbers that we have right now should cover either location, but he'll be discussing that with you later.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'm going to bring my comments and questions in, then I'm going to ask for council to give some thumbs up, but I think I've heard from a lot of you on these topics already. I do want to say that this is much better. We're really working this together, and staff's been working so hard, and during a pandemic it's going to be even harder to work through all these negotiations when you can't meet face to face and you can't run numbers together. You have to run them separately. So I appreciate the flexibility and the due diligence, and also just the hard work that's gone into this. I will say, I think we're going to have an unusual scenario coming up that's going to play, interestingly, hopefully into our favor. If UNC opens up this fall, which is what they're trying to do, there is going to be a huge demand for parking. They have communicated that. They have many people who normally take our transit system who have some immune situations that they would prefer to drive and park if they're coming to campus. So it's going to be an interesting dilemma. There's going to be a demand for parking, and UNC has expressed this and asked, what we're looking at for that. Meanwhile, we're going to have a reduction of parking spaces for the first year because the deck will be torn down. So there'll be additional pressure for more parking spaces between the existing Wallace deck, and hopefully our staff's looking at offering some lease options to people in 140 West because it's underparked right now. And so getting some of those leases transferred over to 140 West pronto, maybe to start in August, as if the university's coming back in August, could play to our benefit for our entire parking enterprise fund. So if UNC doesn't start in August, I don't know what to tell you what the numbers are going to look like. So, and they're trying all different scenarios, folks, and I don't know what they're going to be. But because this deck won't be built for a year and a half from now, we're going to be so much farther into the future, and hopefully things will be back to at least a mostly operating level for everyone. And I think UNC is going to need more than 100 spaces for their visitors and people coming and stuff. So I think there's going to be a huge demand. Plus, we know there's some other demands that aren't being met. UNC has a wait list. We have a wait list. People are looking. It's a prime location. So I think 65% occupancy is low. especially when you factor in big event weekends and all kinds of things of people coming to town. But I'm excited that we're willing to start thinking conservatively, but then be very hopeful that that's not where we end up. So council's been pretty consistent that it wants to do the solar, that it wants to have art, that it wants streetscape, the road improvements. We want to see the differences in the choices. I think I've heard from most people, you want to have some sort of presence in the parking deck from either parking staff and police substation, but at least parking staff to have a place to call home, and B, if this is going to be attracting a lot of people there, we need to have some eyes over there, is what I've heard from quite a number of you. Yeah. Public toilets, the same thing. First time people coming to our community, parking here to participate in whatever they're going to do. We need to make sure that we have places for people to use the restroom. I will say I'd like the car charging personally to be broken out. So that's one estimate, but then to put how much it would cost to run the conduit for, I don't know, and give us an estimate, 50 spaces, 100. I don't know what you want to pick, but the options for that, and it can't be that expensive, but you do, if you can put it down when you're pouring the concrete, it's a lot easier than trying to do it after the fact. So, and I don't know what the best models are. We'd have to ask other parking if you do it all on the, I doubt you do it all on the first floor because that would preempt anybody from a non-electric car to be there, but electric cars are coming. So we want to be prepared for that as well. So if you can help us with that, that would be great. Okay. Council members, are we good with those questions and concerns and renovations to this list, to break out the two, to have all those other things so we have a menu of choices, and we're still waiting to see the improved building costs? Is that thumbs up if that's what we're all thinking? Jess, Karen shaking her head. Let's see, Alan, is that what? Yeah, okay, on then. All right. All right, so can we have a lot more of this presentation to go, and we have another item, so we need to keep, I know this is important though, and you're going to revisit this next week, so don't think this is your only opportunities. We just getting information tonight, and you can always send more questions in to our staff.
So I'm going to turn it over to Bob Jessup now to go through the summary of the Economic Development Agreement.
We lost him. There we're not hearing you.
Well, I wasn't talking yet, so.
Well, that's why.
Okay. I'm trying to have the, I know that you have the summary in your packet. Just want to say this is just supposed to be an update and review of key provisions. And as we stated before, we're not asking for any particular action tonight. We just want to give you an update as to where we are and get council feedback either now or at another time. I'm not going to try to read this to you. Much of what's in here is what we have talked about before, and has been was in the letter of intent, and we've carried it through. Just want a couple of high places where things have changed. We've got one of the ongoing questions that people have had has been the status of getting the fine property under control. The folks from Grove have been engaged with the folks who control that property to try to work that out. And again, that's an ongoing process. Over here on an item that I've marked 5 for your page 4, again, is where we've got this new provision for the lease of the property. Just want to again point out that the monthly rent is a flat fee and that the town keeps everything else. As Amy and Dwight explained, we believe that the numbers will show that the town will not be worse off. The town will be at least in as good a position as it has been through what it's been getting out of the deck so far. We have this provision for the on the construction management plan has been a big question that people have had and wanted to know what was in there. The final economic development agreement will have the main points, the highlights of that plan. Dwight convened the first meeting of that working group for that plan last week. That's a very technical planning process. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to being written down in a single contract because there are a lot of charts, and it's the construction process is a living and breathing process. Item 9 talks a little again about the timing, and this relates to Ms. Stegman's question in number 11. We want to have the construction contract ready for the town to sign by the time we get to the beginning of August, not the beginning of September, so that we can have our local government commission approval at the beginning of September to have the money in hand and start the work then. We'll have to work on that design process and that construction contract process right up until that point. And the third party reviewer will be engaged in that process all along to make sure that it's in a position to give an opinion on the fairness of the construction cost. Again, most of this are things that we have seen before. Item 12 talks about the lot 2 disposition. In the community benefits slide that Joe shared, we showed an estimate of an estimated cost of the work to be done in restoring that area at about $200,000. Items 13 and 14 have been revised from what's in the packet based on further discussions since we finished this outline for the council meeting about the process for GRUB. There was my mistake in the previous version. We want to show that the entitlement application has to be in by July. We're asking GRUB to make a concept plan presentation in August before the town is required to sign the construction contract, and then to have a final complete application for the building by November. So this is a way in which we are again trying to limit the town's risk by making sure that process continues, try to take out any of the places where there could be a chance for things getting off course or stagnated. We have the items 18 and 19 are other provisions that are that were not in the original set of discussions. First was the revenue equivalent. Well, GRUB's always been consistent in offering the revenue equivalent. We're going to have a starting date, a last ditch starting date. In other words, the payment for parking has to start at the earlier of the finishing of one of these buildings or some date certain. And since we haven't talked to GRUB about what that date certain would be, I don't have one in here. We've also had, GRUB has said that if it decides to sell the Wallace Neck property before it completes the new building, the town will have the chance to make a first offer on that building. I have to say, that you've also got the complete text of the EDA if people have questions on that or have either now or later. We'll continue to refine it to match what's in the outline for those changes that I noted are new since we did the outline. Also, again, want to say that the town staff and GRUB have been great partners to work with on this contract, and that the negotiations have been very explicit. People have been very willing to state their interests, and they have been, and both parties have been willing to engage on the difficult questions to try to work them out. So as Dwight has said, we're making great progress to get this ready for final council approval in June. And that's all I have.
Thank you. Council, quick clarifying questions, anyone? Mr. Parker.
They're clarifying, but my initial reaction is that and Alan can probably do a much better job on this than I can, but it strikes me that a number of the provisions, although they sound good, actually don't have any teeth in them or don't have any remedies associated with them. So for example, it says that GRUB has to file a complete application by November, right? That's nice, but what if they don't? And At that point, we've already started construction of the new deck, so they've got the cards, not we. Similarly, provision 19 talks about they have to sell it to us at a price they determine. So if they don't want to sell it to us, they make the price too high that we can't afford it. It seems to me that if there's going to be some kind of a provision that we can buy it back, that there has to be an impartial mechanism for setting a price. I think there are just a number of provisions in there that set time deadlines, but the penalty for not meeting those deadlines is they don't build the building. And how does that help us?
Well, I understand your point. I would say that Dwight has done a great job of pushing for specifics in this performance. I'd say that many times in a contract, if the other party doesn't perform, you're left to your general contract remedies, which is to ultimately sue them for the loss you suffer by their not performing. And we don't have a provision that says, for example, I'm going to use an extreme example just to make the point, that if they don't do their application by July 1st, they've got to pay us $1 million. I mean, something like that's wouldn't be enforceable anyway, because that would be disproportionate to the loss you've suffered at that point. I think that what we have tried to do, and I know there was a council question about this, is to show the ways in which the town's interests are aligned with GRUB and how the benefits to the town accrues its benefits without GRUB building the building. And we've got provisions in there to show, or we've tried to explain why the town is better off going through this process, even if GRUB were to walk away the day after we sign it, which nobody is saying is what they intend. But I do think that's a level of uncertainty that if in fact they don't build the building, they still own it, they still have to pay the taxes on it, there's still the development opportunity for somebody there. And the fact that it's not in GRUB's interest, as Joe and Mr. Grubb explained, it's not in their interest to let it lie fallow, that eventually something will get done there. And this, if this is the council's judgment, this is the best way to incentivize that development while getting the other benefits of this bargain.
Okay. Michael, do you have anything else?
No, not now.
Okay, sorry, I forgot whose hands were waving. Who else had any clarifying questions? Young man?
I heard you talk about that during the construction, the town is going to rent the spaces at Wallace Deck and for our town's operation. Can you pull that section up and explain what exactly how that is going to work?
Sure.
Like starting from when, or what's the timeline for that?
Right, and I did go through all these things quickly, and I'm going to, most of this will be in the actual lease that we have for the debt. And again, we've circulated one of those internally, but we have not yet shared that with with GRUB. This is in item 5 of my sheet. I'll go back to the shared screen. Sorry, that's not the right one. So the idea is that we're going to do the land swap at the time the town is ready to sign the construction contract on or about August 1st. When we sign the EDA, we'll also sign and deliver the lease of the Wallace Deck. So we'll transfer the ownership and immediately lease it back. Then from that day, the town will keep all the revenue and pay GRUB the $30,000 a month. That will continue until the new deck is operational. And it says in the summary, and Grubb's ready to demolish the Wallace deck. The actual key will be the new deck is operational. So until the new deck is up, once the new deck is operational, the lease goes away and Grubb will agree that it will not allow parking to the general public in the Wallace deck after our new deck is open.
Well, then that period will be from the August of this year to until the new deck is being built, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Right. Okay. I think in normal situation, I would think that the town probably have a pretty good chance that we can make, not only can cover the $30,000 lease, we can make a profit from it.
Oh, that's certainly what the town intends, that it's going
Right.
to be as much money as it was.
Right. But the situation is we're in this COVID-19 period, and there is, like, in the past, like the last quarter of this current fiscal year, what I think our manager can give us a better number, but I think is we do not actually have a generated revenue for that from our parking facility. So what the situation is in August and throughout the whole entire period of the construction of this new deck, I do not know. But I mean, no one can know for sure. But from what we heard from CDC and all the experts in this area about how long this pandemic will last, I think for the next 12 months, probably we're going to be in a situation that the parking needs or demand in our downtown probably was going to be significantly reduced. So if that is the scenario, then the town is continuously paying this $30,000 every month to the Grubb. So they do not have any risk. Their revenue is protected by owning this Wallace deck. And the town, if we sign this contract, then we are paying this $30,000 if the situation, which I think is a very good chance that will happen, we do not have the parking revenue coming to this Wallace deck, and that the town is continuously paying $30,000 per month. I kind of worried. I think that is a significant cost for the town. Not only that, we are still paying whatever the left loan that I think we still have not paid off the Wallace deck loan yet. So we need to pay off that from Wallace deck. We also need to pay this extra $30,000 lease to the Grubb. I feel like this is too risky for the town. And I mean, I'm just using this one example. There are many others that I think Michael just mentioned, that it is I think the Grubb property has managed their risk, but the town does not. Of course, they should. I mean, any good business company should do that, manage their risk. I'm just hoping our town will think through what different scenarios that we are getting ourselves in, and what if like different scenarios play out differently, and how we're going to protect ourselves.
So Joe wanted to answer too, but I'm going to just jump in. We will know by the end of the month whether UNC is coming back in the fall. If they are coming back in the fall, the demand for parking in our Wallace deck is going to be huge, because there won't be any parking spaces in the ugly deck because it'll be gone. So there'll be a huge demand for parking. If UNC doesn't come back in the fall, then we may be at risk unless there's some people who want to lease the spaces to guarantee that they have safe passage back and forth to UNC. But because people are going to be more likely to want to drive at first versus transit, people who normally ride transit, it's going to be an interesting scenario. We're not going to know that answer about UNC until the end of this month. Joe, you want to speak, and then Bob?
Can I interject for a second, if you don't mind? I think there's actually a relatively simple way of solving this problem as regards the lease payment, and basically figure out what the percentage of the anticipated what the anticipated revenues of the deck are assumed.
It's about half. The 30K is about half.
So then, just instead of doing a 30,000 fixed fee, make it 50% of net revenues, and that way we both share risk equally. If it goes up, we both make some money. If there's no revenues, neither of us make any money. But I think if we move it to a percentage of revenues rather than a flat rate, we can share the risk equally and address at least that issue.
So we offered that to Grubb and they rejected it. We came back with a $20,000 per month lease and a share of revenues. And I will state that since we're going to all hourly parking, our projections are that it will have a very high occupancy, and we're projecting as much as $1.3 million in income from the Wallace deck. The $700,000 that the mayor referred to was our 2019 income, which is about double what we'd be paying in rent. And so we've got a variable between what we collected in 19, which was not one of our better years at the Wallace deck, to what we're projecting with it all being hourly. And so Amy and I had tried to look at this and say, is that a reasonable risk given the variable at what we think the lowest occupancy could be at this deck? And it felt not uncomfortable to recommend it.
Okay, I had Joe, then Bob, and we got out of sync there.
Yeah, I think it's important to note here, this is not a profit center for Grubb Properties. There's an underlying loan we have on the existing 137, 136 property. And that parking deck that's part of the swap is collateral that's part of that loan. So when we swap the decks, our lender has to accept the Wallace deck as a replacement collateral in that loan. And I know that sounds like a bunch of jargon, but the reason we have to have a fixed lease payment is we can't do that swap, affect that swap without getting our lender comfortable that they have this in place. So in other words, without this, the swap doesn't happen.
Okay, Bob, did you have anything to share with us?
I have a technical point and a more general point. Technical point, I want to make sure it's clear that the debt service related to the Wallace deck is a obligation. It's a liability being paid out of the parking fund as a whole. It is not being, that obligation is not limited to being paid out of Wallace deck revenues. The general question, or the more general point I'd make, is there are two types of risk that the town, that I think I would encourage everyone to try to keep in different buckets. One is the financial risk to the town, and to differentiate between the financial risk in the first 12 months and the financial risk over 15 years. And also the opportunity cost, or the other side of that coin is the long-term benefits as opposed to the short-term costs. And that's, I would just, everybody's got, well, not everybody, there are 7 people who have to make that distinction, that determination. But I would encourage, when we talk about the risk, the financial risk to the town is the risk of building a new park, is the cost of building a new park. The financial risk has nothing to do with what Grubb does.
Maurice, did you want to share something?
Yeah, I think the staff and Grubb Properties have certainly heard the council's concerns about this, and would be something that we would take back to the negotiating table and continue those conversations.
Okay. Thank you. We still have a lot of the presentation to go, folks. Let's keep us moving along, please. Thank you. Again, you'll do a deeper dive on this next week.
Bob, can you release your screen?
Of course. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Who's up next?
Michael Stevenson and Brian Peterson.
Thank you. Do you want me to share mine, or you want to drive it?
I'll drive it.
Okay, go ahead, next. I'm going to try to focus on some of the outstanding items that were brought up at our last session. And by the way, good to see you all again. Good to be back. We've been going through the entitlement process with the other committees, CDC, and last night actually had the ESOB review, which was very good. a number of people have mentioned they wanted to see the parking deck project in the context of a larger area, but also in the context of a larger development vision. So we've created these aerial views to kind of show the bigger vision, how it fits into the bigger picture with the 136, 137, the parking deck, and the future lab office building, 150 East Rosemary. Next, please. And then from the northwest, the view, and we're showing the PV arrays on the top deck of the parking deck, the potential entrances from Columbia and North Street, which we'll get into a little more detail later. Okay, next, please. Brief summary. I think you've seen these. We're about 1,140 some odd spaces. And right now we're planning for 28 vehicle charging stations. As we talked about, some of those may just be fitted out for future actual chargers, but that's what we're showing now. And about 40 bike parking spaces. Next. Since our last meeting, we've gotten the draft TIS, and that was shared last Friday. We reviewed it. Just wanted to put that in the context of our plan and our thinking. Next, please. So these are the 4 potential access points. Rosemary East and West are the ones that we've always been showing that are planned on Rosemary Street. The 2 others that we'd love to see and the TIS actually recommends are one on Columbia Street and another one on North Street. Back please. I want to point out the one on North Street. What we're showing, it would be crossing the back of 2 parking lots of commercial properties. So actually traffic coming and going from there, most of which presumably which would be coming from MLK, would actually not be driving down the section, which is mostly residential. It'd be mostly on the western end, which is commercial use. And then importantly, the crosswalk there, approximately the center of the deck, crossing down to the south. Next, please. One of the important things of these 4 access points has to do with how we distribute the traffic internally. And, we have some topography here, the sloping of the natural grade and the streets, which we want to take advantage of so that we can load and unload the deck at multiple levels, which really helps the internal flow, getting cars in and out. So starting on the right, Rosemary East, coming in at P2. By the time we get to Rosemary West, we're coming in on the 3rd level. Then the Columbia Street entrance is a typo, that's my fault. Columbia Street would be on P3, but it's at the back of the deck. And the North Street, also at the back or at the north side, comes in at P2. So we're kind of giving a nice even loading of the deck on these 2 levels as cars come in and exit. Next, please. So all this is in the context of, we want to make this a better street, and that means not just for cars but for everybody. So for people walking, on bikes, and so forth. And I know just from hearing all of your comments, this is a commonly held value and vision for this street, and we've heard it from all quarters. So we want to put the traffic flow in that context. So just think about, all the things we've been talking about and looking at, and I want to go through a series of diagrams that just kind of explain our logic and our thinking about this. So this is the overall public realm diagram you've seen. Next, please. So we're kind of creating these 3 public spaces that we really think will be, centers of activity and cool places to hang out and so forth. Next, please. So that starts to create pedestrian desire lines where we think people are really going to be walking. Certainly we know already from Rosemary to Franklin on the alleys, and then crossing, coming back and forth from parking to this retail porch, east and west along the south side with these new and renovated buildings. And we're keeping the footpath to the north, going up alongside the sorority house up to North Street. So we really want to, promote this idea of pedestrian connectivity. Next, please. And it all comes together at this crosswalk. The crosswalk's really important to us and how this is going to work. So next, we're going to talk about how cars move in this context. Next, please. So we know we have two peaks, morning and evening. This is a kind of generalized look at an AM peak, where how we think cars will be moving. If you're coming from the east on Rosemary, you would clearly want to make a right-hand turn and get in, on Rosemary East entrance. If you're coming from the west, eastbound on Rosemary, you would most likely want to make a left-hand turn at that first opportunity there, and get right in the deck. And so, what we're trying to do is siphon the traffic off of the street and minimize the traffic driving in front of the deck, and more importantly, crossing that crosswalk. So we think both of those entrances and exits are important for this flow. And then the Columbia access is also great if you're on MLK northbound. You just make a right in and you're in. And then also from North Street is another very handy way if you're coming from MLK southbound, and that brings you on P2. Next, please. What happens if we close that Rosemary West entrance in the morning? Now all that traffic eastbound, it's got to drive all the rest of the length of that facade of the frontage, right in front of the retail porch, right in front of 136, and across the pedestrian crosswalk, and now make a left-hand turn, and you're mixing the other traffic, making the right in. And so we think that kind of exacerbates the pedestrian conflicts here, and also is less convenient for drivers. Okay, next, please. Now go to the evening. Likewise, if you're heading eastbound on Rosemary, you just zip out Rosemary East and go and turn left. Coming out of Rosemary West, you just it's just a right out, and then you're heading west on Rosemary. MLK northbound, you can just head out to Columbia, and also North Street. And as I mentioned, presumably most people leaving from this point would be heading northbound on MLK. So they would be going to north and turning left, again in front of commercial properties, not residential, and then proceeding northbound on MLK. Next, please. And so then if we close the Rosemary West exit, all that traffic needing to go westbound on Rosemary, they can't go out on Columbia because they can't go left. They're all going to have to go out of Rosemary East and then double back and drive in front of the retail porch and across the pedestrian crosswalk. So again, we think that is not as advantageous as keeping that, keeping the west exit. Okay, so that's our discussion on the traffic. I want to talk about office program. There's been a lot of discussion already. I'll show you what we're looking at. This is the site plan, and I will just point out, now you can't see my cursor because I'm not driving it, but if you look on the upper left-hand corner of the plan, we're indicating bike racks there, and in the retail porch, we're indicating bike racks, and we would have these on two levels, P2 and P3, because those are both at street level, depending on which end of the deck you're at. So this is showing the office program for parking management. It's in yellow on the lower left. They need about 1,400 square feet, rough numbers. Just to kind of reiterate the cost impact, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but office structural needs, the floor loading for office is about 80 pounds a square foot. For parking, it's counterintuitive, but it's only about 40 pounds a square foot. So we have to do an upgraded structure there. We have additional code requirements. We have to provide fire separation, air conditioning, and all the interior finishes. So that generates a cost delta of about $130 to $150 a square foot going from parking to office. And so for that space, the 1,400 square feet, that's about $180,000 to $200,000 for parking management. I know that question came up earlier. Next, please. So if we put in the PD substation, they need more space. So that whole purple band would have to be office. That would push the restrooms further east to the other side of the elevator core. And they need about 2,000 square feet. So using that same cost delta, we're talking about 260 to 300,000 square feet for that program. And the third one would be if we need both. And next, please. Councilmember Bwansi asked this question. We think of the two, the police would probably need to be up on the street, eyes on the street and access and so forth. But likely parking management could scoot around the corner there facing the Awasi easement, which is going to be landscape. We really want to keep that retail porch frontage and not fill it in with offices. So we prefer not to put it up there on the eastern end of the Rosemary Street frontage, but this would be an alternative to put it back here. It'd still be daylit at grade and with the sidewalk leading up to it. It just wouldn't be on the street. And so if you did both of them, this is where we're approaching the $500,000, I think $480,000 range to provide both programs. Okay. On design, I know you've seen a lot of this before, but we have made a few updates. We talked about stepping the building last time, and so we're now showing it stepping down on the north side, which we really believe is the right decision. We think it looks good. It works very well. It kind of steps down, follows the scale of the buildings as well as the natural topography. Now we're showing the PV arrays up there. We do have a nice southern exposure, so we think they'll perform well. And we're showing the green screen walls on the east and north facades. Next, please. The section just showing how it steps down. Next. Next. Okay, and then from one too far. Back one. There you go. Your mouse is go forward one, Dwight, please. There, okay.
Just talk it and we'll get the picture back.
Okay. Well, you saw for a moment there the view from the, there you go, from the west. And obviously the west facade is a great opportunity for artwork, which we think would be a great thing to have. The urban park there and the extension of Varsity Alley leading up to the crosswalk and the elevator core. Okay, next please. We've talked about this. Next please. There was a question about with the PV arrays, would you see them? So we created these views and checked the sight lines. So the way we're showing them on those aerial views, they're actually not visible from sidewalk level from across the street. So it has no, I know there's actually a comment in one of our reviews that maybe they would look kind of cool as kind of an eyebrow, which they might, but the way we have them positioned, you actually would not see them. Next. Same thing from this angle because they're set back 18 feet from the wall plane. They're not visible. Next, please. So actually, this is the only place you can kind of get a peek of them. It's in that gap there right by the stair, which is enclosed in glass. you can just see up there in the gray that is the edge of the PV array. So you could actually get a glimpse of them there, but for the most part, they're not visible from the street. Next, please. Then we were asked to show a view from North Street. Because of the dense tree cover on North Street, this is the only spot we could find where we could get a clear view up to the north facade. This actually would be that drive entrance that we were showing on the northwest corner. And there you would get a view of it. And this is showing the height of that to scale as it would look from North Street. Next, please. And finally, there was concern about the size of the deck and the daylight penetration. And we thought maybe the best way to give people a point of reference was to compare it to the RDU deck for two reasons. One, everybody's parked in that deck. And number two, it has an atrium. And there was some concern about the loss of the atrium we had in our original concept. So I think this gives you a better idea of the scale. The red is our proposed parking deck that's superimposed at the same scale over the RDU deck. So you can see that it fits very handily into less than 1/2 of the total RDU deck. So even without the atrium, our daylight penetration is going to be very acceptable. And we don't think it's going to feel dark and dungeon-like at all. So, you know, we just think this was a great way for people to kind of understand from a point of reference that we're all, you know, very familiar with. So that concludes our design presentation. We're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you. Questions, council members? Michael, Parker, Amy, Ryan.
Yeah, just a couple. In terms of the offices, I went a little quick. So in terms of either the police substation or particularly the police substation fronting on Rosemary, if we don't put the police substation there or the parking management office there, what would be there?
I think we'd like to see more of that porch treatment.
And does putting in the parking management in the rear, tucking it in the rear corner, does that cost us any spaces, or is it in space that otherwise would have been vacant?
That would, you would lose 6 parking spaces from the count we showed.
Okay, so that's a little bit of revenue. And the last thing, it's not to suggest that what you're planning to do isn't the right thing to do, but in terms of the west exit from the parking deck, in the evenings, Rosemary backs up from Columbia to the east, and it's likely that that exit will be pretty well blocked by cars. So I don't know how you're planning to manage that, but you know, from 4:30 to 6 or so, there's almost always cars blocking that exit, waiting for the light to change.
I have experienced that personally. I completely understand it. That's why we showed the diagrams separately for AM and PM, because the left turn in is a predominantly morning movement, so you would not have the stacking issue. And then in the evening, yes, that exit would be quite often, I think, you know, hard to get out of. But this is a deck that'll have a lot of monthly parkers. In other words, they understand those, you know, how that works, and you know, people learn quickly, and so they would just, I think, adapt. But I think not giving people that option is going to do more harm overall, you know, in the big picture than not having that option.
No, I wasn't suggesting you not do it, but I think it's going to be somewhat less effective than we'd like.
I agree. At the PM peak, you know, that we could potentially get backed up, but you know, giving people more options, like I said. Actually, another thing I want to mention is in our ESAB review last night, there's actually a sustainability rating system specifically for parking decks. It's called Park Smart. And one of the actual criteria is providing multiple paths in and out. So it actually gives you sustainability points to provide redundancy. So it's just kind of to point out that I think it's pretty widely recognized as that's best practices to provide that level of redundancy.
Oh yeah, I have no doubt of that.
Okay, Amy, Ryan, anyone else? Wave your hand at me. Hong Min.
I just want to follow up on what Michael was saying. The TIA, they were emphatic about not wanting that West Rosemary exit. It wasn't, they really see some big problems there. And I know the TIA is still evolving, but I'm trying to imagine at AM peak folks backing up through the intersection there, trying to wait to make a left turn into the deck. I mean, I understand from a pedestrian and from a circulation point of view, what you're trying to accomplish. I just think that the traffic is going to be so difficult here. And they were really pushing back on that. I think at the AM peak, you could have folks take a left turn, head up Columbia Street and come in that Columbia exit, for example. I mean, I think there's ways to work around that.
Well, I don't
go
want to
ahead.
get too philosophical. You know, clearly we have a different point of view, but they were also under that presumption requiring a pedestrian overpass, which we also don't want.
Right,
So
right.
it's a question, I think, of prioritizing cars over everything else, and that's where we differ.
I think that there's some of that here, but I think there's a point when we have to make sure that the cars are working. So, and I think that there's concern that they're not going to work with that new plan. And another thing in the TIA analysis, they looked and they were having the Columbia Street being an exit only and the North Street being an entrance only, I believe. So they weren't, so North Street wasn't, for example, a full movement. Neither one of those alternatives was a full movement.
That is correct.
No, we're not showing the Columbia as a full move. It's a right in, right out.
I mean, that Columbia Street was not, you couldn't enter the deck from there. That was a deck exit. And that the North Street was only a deck entrance, not a deck exit.
I realize that, and part of that rationale was not to direct traffic to a residential street, but where we're locating it on that northwest corner, it's going across a commercial frontage, not residential. So I think that's worth more study that would actually have an adverse impact on the residential.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure you were aware of that. I agree with you. I think North Street should be two-way for sure. And I think there's ways we can impact the residential, but yeah, those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Hong Bin, and then Karen, did you have your hand up? Thank you. Okay.
Well, I just want to say that this presentation actually I found very helpful, and I'm appreciative for a lot of the things that you put in. And first try to help the council to understand the scale and the changes, and also for the community to understand what it looks like. You have provided the different angles and especially the experience from the street level and the experiences from the community. I think I'm very appreciative for you to do that, because I'm having a hard time to explain to people what's the impact of this parking deck is going to be to the community. So I think your presentation, I think, is very helpful for me to do that, to do my job, to explain to the community how it feels like walking on the street, how it feels like for the people living in the neighborhoods. I think that's very helpful. And for you to provide that the scale, especially in comparison with the RDU parking deck, I think that's very helpful as well. Because I mean, without seeing that, people have a hard time to really imagine what's the scale looks like. And I think these are all very helpful. I agree with Michael and Amy, their comments on the traffic. I think it's very difficult location, high traffic. I understand all that, but I think that apparently you have put a lot of thoughts into that as well. I'm just hoping that there will be a good solution that will actually make it work. But I understand all the challenges, but I'm just being appreciative for the efforts that you put in to make that work. And especially you're trying to prioritize the experience of pedestrians and the multimodal experience on that street. I'm just very appreciative for you to do that.
Thank you.
All right, Karen.
I just have one question. Might have multiple parts, but I wanted to ask about the green screen. I've seen photos where it's attractive, but I've seen many where it's not. Is the purpose purely camouflage, or does it provide any other environmental benefits, or, you know, and what's the upkeep, and just some of those questions?
It's mostly aesthetic. There is a, I mean, you know, there is a, I don't know if it's measurable, but there is a certain amount of transpiration that occurs, you know, evaporative cooling. I don't think it's anything major, but it's really more about creating something, particularly facing the residential properties, that is not going to be alienating or overly harsh. It does require a certain amount of maintenance. What we're planning right now is to have a drip irrigation system as part of that. The north facade, we're looking at shade tolerant or shade loving climbing vines like Boston ivy. So we think it's viable, but I mean, like anything else, it's going to require a little bit of maintenance and looking after. But yeah, we think it's a workable solution. And if it's neglected, it may not look as good as it could, as it might, but I have confidence the town of Chapel Hill will take good care of it.
Okay, thanks.
Jess?
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. This is helpful. So I wanted to revisit some of the questions, and Karen's question is a good segue, I think, about kind of the appearance and the facade. So I think what I understood from the last section of the presentation, that this was about a $900,000 treatment in what you presented here. Is that right?
That's the information we're getting from the cost estimator, yes.
Okay, and give or take, under, you know, obviously. So can you tell me, understanding that appearance and aesthetic are personal experiences, so some people may love it and some people may wish it looked different, but what are the other options in terms of the aesthetic and the facade? And if, you know, I agree that some of the green wall sometimes looks nice, sometimes to me not so much either, but I like the concept, but I'm just wondering what are the other things we could do? So what's my like Cadillac version? If I go up to 1.6 million, what is amazing about that? And then if I back off of the 900,000, give or take, that we're at, where do I end up? I guess I'm just trying to gauge not only, you know, how it feels to be around the building, how people who live down there, who are walking by it, who are experiencing it as kind of an integral part of our downtown, you know, what are our options, given that, yes, it is a parking deck. So I understand it's not going to be some amazing architectural masterpiece, but as we're thinking about how this feels and having this building down there for many decades, what are our options in terms of making it look amazing versus not?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge Brian Peterson's presentation. I thought he really, you know, in kind of plain English, explained the challenges inherent in parking deck design, particularly urban parking decks. And, you know, sort of like there's kind of two ways. You either make the structure the architecture, or you try to clad it somehow. And so we're kind of doing the latter because a precast parking deck is like you know, these are standardized components that you just put together, and there's really no opportunity to customize. They're very minimal opportunities. So we're looking at cladding a precast structure is what we're doing. And secondly, because it's a naturally ventilated structure, it has to have a certain degree of openness. So we can't just, you know, absolutely cover it all up. So those are kind of our constraints that we're operating within. I think if you went up in cost, the things you would start looking at, and I know you got a presentation from a citizen showing some of the more historical or decks in historic context that were mostly brick, I mean, that would be one direction to go. The brick itself has a cost, but more importantly, it's heavy, and you have to add a lot of structure to hold it up. So that incurs costs. I think that would not be the preferred direction here, actually. And I think, as Brian pointed out, there are issues of taking a traditional language and just blowing it up in scale to something that is alien to the original application of it. But other ways, if you kind of wanted to do, like you said, a gold-plated version, we could be looking at some really elegant kind of curtain wall, more glass and metal types of cladding. And I think at a certain point, it gets to become an aesthetic, judgment. If you think one is better than the other, I have my preferences and others would have different ones. I think the green screen one is actually a moderately priced one because it's basically, you have to pay for the soil and irrigation, but it's basically a kind of a wireframe, fairly lightweight system that the plants kind of do the work for you in terms of cladding. So I think it's for this particular, for our context and our budget and so forth and aesthetics, we think it's a really good direction. There could be others we could look at. On the Rosemary frontage, the emphasis there is to try to counteract the horizontality of those decks. So we've created a large notch in the middle with the stair elevator tower. So I think the big moves, I think, are the right moves in terms of kind of the massing, doing what we can do, locating stairs and elevators, wrapping the porch. And then that brings us to the facade itself, where we're trying to articulate it more into vertical bays, which relates to kind of the downtown. If you walk down walk down Franklin Street, those storefronts are 30 feet wide, 20, 30 feet wide. That's kind of the traditional downtown. So that articulation that we're doing there is relating to that, not in a literal not trying to replicate it, but referencing that and bringing that scale into it. And so then now we're looking at, there's a solid piece and an open piece because we have to have the ventilation. The solid piece we're looking at, it might be brick, it might be terracotta, which is a clay product, or something else, very durable. And then the infill panels have to be some sort of metal that would have openings within them. We could also be looking at glass there. So I think where we are is a reasonable cost range and a good design. We're always happy to spend more money if people think it really advances our cause. I don't know that it necessarily would, but if you'd like to see more options, that's something we could look into.
Could we have Brian Peterson comment?
Sure. I think, Dwight, can you go back to the slide
Yeah, I'd like to see it.
The porch perspective? That's fine. Yeah, that one, one more ahead. So I think Michael's hit on some very good themes, and good to talk to everybody again tonight. And so we did talk last Friday about the difficulties of this kind of structure. And I think what you see here is an attempt to try to create some verticality. And also, I think what this slide brings up is, what is the porch going to be like? And I think what I've talked about with Michael is providing another material there. For instance, wood. You could see it here in the ceiling and use somewhat on the wall to, bring in a somewhat softer material here to change it, to give this area a little bit more character. The other thing that this slide points out is the stair tower. I know that when this project went through the CDC earlier, when it was in a different form, the towers were at the corners, and there was concern about, and I had this as well, as this porch area would be kind of isolated. But I think you can see with the glass stair tower, people would be coming down to be able to look into the porch. That adds a little bit of theatricality. It spills out onto the porch. And incidentally, you did note that in one of those options with the police station, that porch down there would get covered up with the restroom, which would take up a chunk of the retail porch. So that would be a challenge, trying to figure out what to do, and that you don't want a glass wall on the side of a restroom there. So in this image, notice the
Durham Hotel or something has kind of that theme where then you close the door and you're invisible. So you could really mess with people if you wanted, but I would say no.
That's the 21C Hotel.
Yeah, 21C.
Yes. My wife and I stayed there for our anniversary just before the pandemic.
Yeah. It's a little disturbing, but interesting.
Yes.
Maybe.
So, we could have some kind of voyeuristic element to jazz up.
No.
Not suggesting that, but also I want to bring to your attention, look at the street. What they're showing is a continuation of brick pavers or something across the street. This might be something that continues into the park across the way. This is also, Michael, it looks like you're showing a speed table there. I think there might be some kind of traffic calming that would be done here to bring the pedestrian realm across the street.
Yeah, we were hoping to elevate the crosswalk, yes.
Yeah. And, Hong Bin, you brought up I think you were talking about the park across the street. You brought up what that would be. And I just wanted to get back to that, because what you see in these renderings is kind of a placeholder for the design of those public spaces. They have yet to be designed. This is Michael and I and his colleagues met on the site several weeks ago. We just discussed some very preliminary thoughts, just something that could be in the rendering. But that would most likely be a part of the office building design. Am I right, Michael? When that would be decided?
The town green, yes.
Yeah. And so there's a little bit of time, and I think the team will need some input from the town on exactly what's going to be in those spaces. So.
Okay.
Yeah. Going back to Jess.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, this is a good image to kind of pause on, because I think in terms of some of your questions, really what we do at the street level is probably the most important. So, this is where 95% of people's experience is what they walk right by. So I do think doing this porch and, giving attention to this lower level is where we should be putting our energy and some of our money.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if we could back up to the perspective that shows the corner. I don't know if that was.
One more back.
This also, I think, is showing on the corner how the idea of wrapping the porch adds to the interest at the street level. No, it looks like, Michael, there's a kind of grand stair that leads you up to that that second level.
Yeah.
I think, there was a question at the last meeting about, well, what is it like for you when you're inside the building? And this is a major entrance that comes up from the porch that leads you into this area that's all open to light. And so I think, if you imagine you're parking in there, you're going to walk to this sort of area where there's light, and you're going to go down the stair and into this main space. I think any of these attempts to bring circulation together from the inside to the outside to this hub reinforces the building being kind of plugged into the urban fabric a little bit more.
So how hard would it be to give us several different or some options in terms of the style or just the facade? And I understand that the majority of the work is around the finances and making sure the traffic works and getting people in and out. So I don't mean to, if it's really like a big deal to create different kind of styles, then that doesn't have to be where we spend tons of time. But I'm just wondering, like for me, I look at that material, whatever it is above the wood on like floor 3, and that is like, ugh. I just I don't like it, but it doesn't mean that other people won't love it. So I know that it's just, you know, and again, I understand that the experience is really on the bottom floor, but I'm just wondering, especially like given where it is. And I think that part of the acceptance and excitement from the community will partially be about how well they feel like this works with the surrounding area in terms of the style. So are there other styles that you've considered or ones that we could see, or do you really feel like this is just kind of the direction we have to go if we want to do this project?
We were planning to, at the next iteration, particularly on the Rosemary Street facade, develop some different material and colors, you know, on this treatment here. This is a little bit, it was sort of neutral because we were, as you pointed out, wrestling with some bigger moves. But we were playing.
Totally understood. Okay,
So
that
yeah,
would be
we're
great to be able to see some other options or just kind of get different feels. Like, you know, I personally love Graham Street, like the little kind of funky stores over there. And I think it's a cool feeling. And then there are other places that also have a cool feeling too. But I think it does really, even though it is a parking deck, I think we could make the street feel really cool and fit in with the parks and with the other spaces in a neat way, potentially. So my final question is, and this, again, you can give me the reality check, I will not be offended, but I know that the CDC brought up potentially that it would feel better in massing if we broke it up into 2 buildings. So is that just cost prohibitive, or is there some other reason on this site that doesn't work, or is there a potential of talking about that or having that be on the table?
well, it would be a lot more expensive, but it'd also be a lot less efficient. You could not get the efficient ramping that we have here. You'd have to have double the amount of stairs and double the amount of elevators because now there's 2 separate buildings. Each one would have to function separately. So I wouldn't even venture a guess of how much it would impact the cost, but it would be it would also be a much less efficient use of the land. And I don't think you'd be able to park as many cars on the property.
That's a fair answer. I just wanted to get the reality check. Well, thank you. This is a super helpful presentation.
Thanks.
Other council member questions? I'll throw in my comments. Thank you. Can you hear, yeah, the picture there. The 28 EV charging stations, that's like 2% of all the spaces. And as we know, the world's going to be changing, and we know our community really, really loves EV cars. Is there a way to double that? So at least we're doing 4%, or just the conduit. I know that we're not ready to put all those stations in, but is there a way to make it another floor of it or something like that? I just think 28 is way too small for an 1,100 space charging parking deck. So I don't know what the normal rationale is. Our community has a lot of electric cars, and there's a lot of desire to do that, and it's just going to grow over time. Next, the trees out front, the spaces you have for them seem pretty, someone else used the word stingy. Would like them to be, the green parts to be noticeable. We did the streetscape on Franklin Street with the raised beds. I know we've had issues. We need to run water to whatever we do there, but can there be something a little bit better than just a trees, like it's a desert between each of them with the other scaping? Can they be a little bigger or longer boxes or just something?
Well, that's a good point. There's 2 things. One is that when we put in too many trees in the renderings, you can't see the building, and it's just for graphic presentation. But so sometimes we thin them out just for the renderings. But more importantly, actually, we've had meetings with the fire marshal, and we like to space trees like about 30 feet on center max to give a nice continuous canopy. But they were asking for a larger spacing so they can get their equipment up in between them. But I agree with you. I would rather see a more closer spacing of the trees with a nice canopy. I don't know exactly the fire marshal's specific requirement, but we're gonna have to find a reasonable point of agreement there.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I know they have to get close enough to the building to put out a fire from, but is the new deck going to have a fire sprinkler suppression system?
I believe it has a dry system, yes.
Okay, that might, I don't know, I'm not the fire marshal, sorry, but it just seems like we're doing so much to improve the whole area back there, but if we just have a tree every so often, they're going to start off very small.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that there's water along there. We have also talked about actually having a tap somewhere along the wall for the food trucks as well, just to have water places so that we can do the things we need to do.
Right.
Okay. Agree with Jess on seeing some other, I don't know, that just, I love the project so much better and it's grown. I love the porch and love the corner and love the glass staircase, but that metal framing, it just doesn't seem like you're close to the historic district. There's something different that we could look at to see if it made any difference.
Okay.
Material wise. Okay. All right. Do we have more to this presentation?
Nope.
Okay. So thank you all for all the hard work on this. It's coming along really well, and we're going to keep seeing it probably at multiple meetings until the June 30th date and public hearings, and it's still going through the development process review. We love all the collaboration. Brian Peterson, thanks for helping out in there too, because you've heard a lot of the comments and added to that. The manager and I have talked about postponing the budget presentation this evening since it's been a long evening already. And we've had a lot of information thrown at us, and budget information is ever evolving right now, so that we would push that off till next week if that's okay with council members. Yeah, Marie said he could make a quick summary of something, and then on our work sessions, we allow the public to have some comment at the end if we have some time. I don't know that we have too many people here, but we want to allow some comments just to hear them. So Maurice, do you want to share anything about the budget?
Thank you, Mayor. Just real quick, as council may remember, when we were originally talking about this work session, it was a budget work session. It turned into something else, and because we needed to do it, quite frankly. And I think it was a really great discussion tonight on several really important issues to the council and our community. So I thank you for all of that you've put into preparing for this and the great conversation that we had tonight. So all I would say is that you saw the presentation that was in your packet. We will send you the updated presentation. We added just a little bit of information about the enterprise funds. It will not be significantly different than what you would see next week anyways. We will anticipate obviously having the presentation of the manager's recommended budget to you for next week. And then of course, we'll have several opportunities after that, if deemed necessary, to discuss the budget. We do have a work session scheduled for the 27th, and that will be a good opportunity to have the same type of discussion that we would have had with you this evening. So thanks again for your active involvement in our discussion tonight and your patience. But I think it was a good, healthy discussion that we needed to have on a couple of really important topics. So thank you for that. And we look forward to talking to you about the budget next week.
Thank you. If you are an attendee at this and you're wishing to share public comment, if you would either send a message to the chat. We didn't have anyone sign up ahead of time. Mr. Parker will help you transition into giving us your feedback. While that is going on, I'll share with council that the mayors and chair, we meet almost every day, it feels like. We met this morning to talk about where we are with phase 1 and phase 2 looming in front of us. A lot of multiple discussions going on. We're going to meet again Friday after waiting to hear what the governor is going to propose, because originally he said phase 1 could be 2 or 3 weeks. With the science and the data that is out there, we have some strong concerns about moving too quickly into a phase 2 approach. I've heard from multiples of you that you have some of the same concerns. Reaching out to some members of the business community to find out where they are thinking and what's going on. But we're going to meet on Friday in hopes that we have learned what the governor is or isn't doing. And we're talking to our neighbors in Durham as well to see what they are or aren't doing. as we move forward. So you can rest assured that we're aligned in protecting people. We also want our economy to get started too, but there's a balance, and we are trusting the science and the data. And we're, yeah, there's a lot of collaborating going on in multiple ways, but it's, like I said, UNC is going to make their decision by the end of the month. There's just a lot going on in our community, and I hear from multitudes of residents about how concerned they are about any kind of outbreak or spread in our community. We've been very lucky so far because we've been very diligent in all the things we've done. So, Michael, have you heard from anybody?
There does not appear to be anyone who wishes to address us.
Okay, well, I will remind the public or anyone watching or attending later that we always welcome emails. That's the best way to communicate with us right now. And so we appreciate your comments. We don't vote in work sessions, we just review. So we welcome your comments, and please send them to us. All right, anything else to share? Thank you for, it was a lot of information tonight and a lot of good work that you guys have all been working on. And so we appreciate it. So thank you very much. Everyone stay safe, and don't forget about the virtual opening on Friday. And then we have 2 meetings next week, council members, to remind you. We have a Wednesday night council meeting and a Thursday night closed session, which will now contain 2 items. So it'll be a little longer than originally anticipated. So just to let you know. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. See you, everyone.
Stay safe.
Night.
Wait for Amy to come back. Wanted to ask her a question. Ty, you've left the meeting.
This camera's on, but the microphone is